11. The Anunnaki and the CIA. Truman Bathuram was a Californian, born in 1898, who spent much of his early years working jobs that never seemed to last. His first marriage both began and crumbled during the Second World War. He entered into a second marriage only several months after the war ended, and ultimately wound up working in the harsh, hot deserts of Nevada, specifically in the highway construction game. It was while Bathuram was out in the desert, in 1952, and while his second wife, Mary, was stuck at home in Santa Barbara, California, that Bathuram claimed he had an extremely close encounter with extraterrestrials on Mormon Mesa, a near 2,000-foot high mount in Nevada's Mopa Valley. On the fateful night in question, and after the working day was over, Bathuram climbed the mountain, primarily to search for shells, something that Mary particularly enjoyed collecting. The story goes that Bathuram was rendered into a strange, altered state of mind, during which advanced aliens suddenly manifested before him, having arrived in a huge, gleaming, flying saucer. Although only around 5 feet in height, the aliens were eerily human-looking and claimed to come from a faraway planet called Clarion. Not only that, their leader was one Captain Aura Rains, a shapely, Pamela Anderson, type that Bathuram described as being tops in shapeliness and beauty. All thoughts of Mary back in Santa Barbara were suddenly gone from Bathuram's mind. Bathuram, 1954. Bathuram's story continued and grew at a steady and controversial pace, as did his relationship with the flirty Captain Rains. Although Bathuram does not explicitly say so, there are more than a few nuggets of data in Bathuram's collective work that suggests on a couple of occasions the pair had just about the closest and most intimate encounters of all. It's hardly surprising that many students of ufology outright dismiss Bathuram's story as either a hoax, or a fantasy born out of Bathuram's unhappiness with both wife number 1 and 2. There is, however, a very intriguing aspect of the Bathuram affair that is seldom touched upon or even noted. One person who did take note of it was Whitley Strieber, whose 1987 best-selling book, Communion, brought the world of alien abductions to a massive, mainstream audience. During the course of investigating his experiences that prompted him to write Communion, Strieber discovered something remarkable. The name Aura Rains was extremely similar to Arakrian, a Gaelic term that translates approximately to heavenly body of air. It must be said to that the fashion by which Bathuram became entranced by Aura Rains mirrors to an almost identical degree with those centuries-old cases of hapless and helpless Gaelic men falling under the spell of the Fairy Queen, as described in the previous chapter, Strieber, 1987. And the links didn't end there. U.S. government knowledge of the Anunnaki. It's worth noting that in the very same time frame that the affair of Truman Bathuram was playing out, affair, quite possibly, being a very appropriate word, the CIA was closely and secretly watching certain developments in Central Africa, specifically in what until the 1960s was termed the Belgian Congo. Echoing how the Anunnaki were mining for gold in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago, in 1915 a man named Robert Rich Sharp discovered a huge vein of uranium at a mine in the town of Shinkolobwe, in the Congo. Huge only barely fits the bill. Edgar Sengier, the Belgian director of the Union Minière du Haut-Katanga mining company, secured no less than 4,200 tons of uranium from the massive vein that extended for more than 400 kilometers, almost 250 miles. Such was the quality of the uranium, it was used extensively in the U.S. government's Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb at the height of the Second World War. Overseeing the uranium production at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was Major General Kenneth Nichols. He said of the uranium deposits in the Belgian Congo, our best source, the Shinkolobwe mine, represented a freak occurrence in nature. It contained a tremendously rich load of uranium pitchblende. Nothing like it has ever again been found. Nichols, 1987. What does the CIA know of the Anunnaki? All of this brings us back to 1952, the CIA, and flying saucers. A CIA document of August 16, 1952, reveals. Recently, 2 fiery disks were sighted over the uranium mines located in the southern part of the Belgian Congo in the Elisabethville district, east of the Luapula River which connects the Meru and Benguelo lakes. The disks glided in elegant curves and changed their position many times, so that from below they sometimes appeared as plates, ovals, and simply lines. Suddenly, both disks hovered in one spot and then took off in a unique zigzag flight to the northeast. A penetrating hissing and buzzing sound was audible to the onlookers below. The whole performance lasted from 10 to 12 minutes, Central Intelligence Agency, 1952. The story continued that a Commander Pierre, who operated out of a nearby airstrip called Elisabethville, and to whose attention the presence of the UFOs had been brought, raced to his fighter plane and was soon in the skies, in hot pursuit. Incredibly, Pierre actually managed to close in on one of the craft, to a perilously close 120 meters, (0.075 miles). In such dicey, near proximity, Pierre was able to get a good look at the object before him. It was, he said, somewhere between 12 and 15 meters, 39 to 49 feet, in diameter, shaped like a discus, and aluminum-like color. It had an inner core that remained completely still, while its outer rim was aflame and spinning, something that led the commander to conclude that the UFO must have had an enormous speed of rotation, ibid. The movements of the UFOs made it clear to Pierre that what he was seeing was not secret, prototype aircraft. They traveled both horizontally and vertically. Their elevation went from 800 to 1,000 meters, approximately 0.5 to 0.62 miles, in barely a second or two, and, at one point they even dramatically dropped to heights of barely 60 feet above the trees surrounding the mine. Due to the devastating effects of incredible G-forces that such maneuvers would have had on a pilot, Pierre could only conclude that the vehicles were remotely flown by whom, he had no idea. The chase came to an end when, after about 15 minutes, both UFOs suddenly made loud, piercing whistling noises and accelerated to what Pierre concludes was around 1,500 kilometers per hour, 932 miles per hour, and were gone from view in an instant. Whereas the report itself is an undeniable standout one, it's what happened after the report reached the CIA that is far more interesting and of relevance to the story of the Anunnaki and the genetic manipulation of the human race. The documentation along with a freshly written report from Commander Pierre were studied very closely by personnel from the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, OSI. They came to 3 notable conclusions. 1. Commander Pierre was a first-class witness. 2. There seemed to be no reason to doubt his testimony, given his very close proximity to one of the UFOs, and 3. A study should be initiated to determine how many more mines in Africa were associated with sightings of UFOs. Interestingly, for reasons that are not clear, the OSI recommended that the study should also encompass sightings of UFOs in the vicinity of gold mines in Africa. Did someone in the CIA, even as early as the formative years of the 1950s, know something of the Anunnaki's ancient links with Africa, gold, and mining programs? If so, were they concerned the Anunnaki were now back, among us once again, and checking out our very own mining operations in those areas of the globe they once dominated, all of those millennia earlier? And there's one more thing to note on this most curious, but fascinating issue. Crash go the space gods. For decades, rumors have circulated to the effect that, in early 1952, a UFO crashed on the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen. Tales of crashed UFOs, secretly recovered along with the remains of their dead crews, abound in ufology. What's particularly fascinating about the Spitsbergen case is that the craft itself, allegedly secretly donated to U.S. military personnel by the Norwegian government, was reportedly transported to Kentucky, specifically Fort Knox. A U.S. Army installation, Fort Knox is also home to the United States Bullion Depository, USBD, which in turn is home to the nation's supply of gold, which amounts to around 3% of all the gold ever refined by man, throughout recorded history. Such is the scale and value of the massive gold holdings at the USBD. The current, combined value of the gold is estimated to be around $380 billion. So, we have a very curious situation here. We have the Truman-Bethurum affair of 1952, a case that has significant links to matters of a Celtic nature, the Celts having a lineage that ties them to the Basques and, further back in time, to the genetically manipulated Cro-Magnons. In that same year, specifically that summer, the CIA recommends that careful attention should be paid to reports of UFO activity in the vicinity of African gold mines. And, on top of that, and also in 1952, the remains of a crashed UFO are reportedly secretly shipped to Fort Knox. Should we consider the incredible possibility that the Spitsbergen craft contains significant amounts of Anunnaki gold on board? Possibly, yes. If such a find was made, that may well have prompted the CIA to look for additional reports of UFOs seen in the vicinity of mining activity and particularly gold mining. 12. Close encounters of the Celtic kind. In the very same time frame that Truman-Bethurum was under the hypnotic spell of the fairy-like and Celtic named Aura Rains, a man named George Adamski was claiming amazing encounters with human-like extraterrestrials in the deserts of California. There's no doubt that Adamski was, and still is, the ultimate contactee regardless of what one might make of his claimed experiences with the long-haired, human-looking space brothers, as he termed them. What is particularly interesting is that one of Adamski's alleged brothers from the stars was named Furkan. Strieber says of this, Fur or fear when used as a prefix means man, and Khan, meaning head, is the name of a 7th century Irish king whose son, tradition tells us, was abducted by a beautiful lady in a flying craft. Furkan means, in Gaelic, man of Khan, Strieber, 1987. A Brazilian bloodline. It's now time to turn our attentions to one of the most controversial of all alien encounters, one that has notable implications for the Gaelic UFO connection. On February 22, 1958, a young Brazilian farmer named Antonio Villas-Boas prepared for a Dr. Olavo Fontes, both a respected gastroenterologist at the National School of Medicine in Rio de Janeiro and a highly dedicated flying saucer investigator, a remarkable, and undeniably sensational, document that told of his, Villas-Boas's, close encounter with an alien only 8 days earlier. But, this was no sterile take-me-to-your-leader style experience involving bug-eyed, spindly creatures with an interest in Villas-Boas's rectum. No. According to the 23-year-old farmer, he went where, quite possibly, no man had ever gone before. So Villas-Boas told Fontes, he did nothing less than get it on with a hot babe from the great and mysterious beyond. I live with my family on a farm which we own, near the town of Francisco de Sales, in the state of Minas Gerais, close to the border with the state of Sao Paulo, Villas-Boas told Fontes as he began his torrid tale of sex from the stars. It all went down on the night of October 5th, the man himself explained, when he encountered a very white light, and I don't know where it came from. It was as though it came from high up above, like the light of a car headlamp shining downwards, spreading its light all around. It finally went out and did not return. Villas-Boas, 1958. Well, not for long, anyway. Barely a week later, the same lighted object, or, at the very least, a near identical one, appeared over the farm while Villas-Boas was chilling out on the family's tractor after a hard day and night toiling in the field. Looking somewhat like a cartwheel and hovering about 300 feet from the ground, it bathed the area with a bright red glow for a few moments that, even from a distance of more than 100 feet, made Villas-Boas's eyes sting like crazy. Suddenly it was gone, or its lights were extinguished, and it was now hovering in complete silence and darkness. But the main act was about to come, as, so it transpired, was Villas-Boas. 24 hours later, Villas-Boas was still toiling hard in the field when, in his own words, at precisely 1 a.m., I suddenly saw a red star in the sky. In a few moments it had grown into a very luminous, egg-shaped object, flying towards me at a terrific speed. It was moving so fast that it was above the tractor before I had time to think what I should do. It was all an amazed Villas-Boas could do to stare in complete awe at the craft above him. That all turned to cold fear when the vehicle descended to a height of maybe now more than 75 feet, at which point Villas-Boas wisely thought his best course of action was to run like hell and to get as far away from the whatever it was as possible. Unfortunately, or perhaps, fortunately, it didn't quite work out like that. It came nearer and nearer, said Villas-Boas, who added, I was now able to see it was a strange machine, rather rounded in shape, and surrounded by little purplish lights. It was like a large elongated egg with 3 metal spurs in front. On the upper part of the machine there was something which was revolving at great speed and also giving off a powerful fluorescent reddish light, ibid. It might not seem much right now, but as the story progresses, Villas-Boas's description of the craft takes on new, and highly profound, significance. Still thinking of running to the safety of the farmhouse, Villas-Boas's course of action was brought to a sudden halt when he found himself feeling dizzy, groggy, and disoriented. Villas-Boas was in a state of quickly escalating incapacitation. He managed to make it just a few dozen yards before powerful hands grabbed him by the arm. Terror-stricken, Villas-Boas found himself face to face with a human-looking individual about 5 feet in height and dressed in a flight suit-type outfit. As for the craft, it was sitting a short distance away and still emitting its powerful, blinding lights, which semi-obscured its specific shape, something that may have been a deliberate action to hide its real identity, as will soon be revealed. Adrenalized and scared, Villas-Boas tried to lash out, to no avail. By then, feeling very unsteady on his feet and drunk as a skunk, he was quickly overpowered as 3 other characters raced out of the craft to help their comrade. Worse, they proceeded to drag him toward the brilliantly lit craft. Not a good sign. After the 4 men finally managed to haul Villas-Boas inside the very cramped confines, they rapidly removed his clothing and shoved him into a small room, and he found himself covered, head to foot, in what sounds like several bottles of shower gel. Then, after Villas-Boas was hosed down, a blood sample was taken from his chin, after which he was taken to another, equally small room. Actually, this one was almost closet-like that, alarmingly, was quickly filled with dense smog that had him gasping for air. In Villas-Boas's own words, it was as though I was breathing a thick smoke that was suffocating me, and it gave the effect of painted cloth burning. I did not feel well and the nausea increased so much that I ended up vomiting, ibid. A good stallion to improve their own stock. Thankfully, and finally, after what seemed like a torturously long wait, there was light at the end of the tunnel. Very welcome light, indeed. We're talking about a close encounter. Not of the first, second, or even third kind, mind you. It was one thing to get nabbed by aliens, taken on board their craft, and hosed down like a muddy, old car. It was quite another to get rewarded after that traumatic experience with a fine and tasty piece of extraterrestrial ass. But, Villas-Boas told Fontes, that's exactly what happened. A metal door opened, and in walked a naked woman. At this stage, it's perhaps best to get the lowdown from the man of the hour. Her eyes were large and blue, more elongated than round, being slanted outwards, the cheekbones were very high, her lips were very thin, hardly visible, her body was much more beautiful than that of any woman I have ever known before. It was slim, with high and well-separated breasts, thin waist and small stomach, wide hips and large thighs. Another thing that I noted was that her hair in the armpits and in another place was very red, almost the color of blood, ibid. And it was what he tactfully, and almost engagingly innocently, referred to as another place that Villas-Boas had his sights set on. He didn't have to wait long, however, nor did he have to break the ice with a bit of meaningless chatter. The seemingly real-life Barbarella was decidedly proactive and on him in a flash. She came toward me silently, looking at me with the expression of someone wanting something, and she embraced me suddenly and began to rub her head from side to side against my face. I became uncontrollably excited, sexually, a thing that had never happened to me before. I ended up by forgetting everything, and I caught hold of the woman, responded to her caresses with other and greater caresses. Some of the grunts that I heard coming from that woman's mouth at certain moments nearly spoiled everything, giving the disagreeable impression that I was with an animal. Finally, she was tired and breathing rapidly. I was still keen, but she was now refusing, trying to escape, to avoid me, to finish with it all, Ibit. Evidently, although Villas-Boas wasn't exactly enamored of the woman's animalistic vocalizations, he clearly considered himself to be quite the stud muffin, as he told Fontes, that was what they wanted of me, a good stallion to improve their own stock, Ibit. Perhaps as a way of convincing Villas-Boas that his friend with benefits was not of this earth, he explained that as the woman moved to exit the room she turned to me, pointed at her belly and then pointed toward me, and with a smile she finally pointed towards the sky. I think it was in the direction of the south. Then, after a quick tour of the craft during which Villas-Boas was sternly admonished by one of the crew members for trying to steal a small device to take home, he was unceremoniously escorted off the craft, and watched as it, and his grunting girl from another galaxy, left for pastures new, Ibit. As Villas-Boas recalled to Fontes, the craft continued to rise slowly into the air until it had reached a height of some 30 to 50 meters. The whirring noise of the air being displaced became much more intense, and the revolving dish that sat atop the object began to turn at a fearful speed. At that moment, the machine suddenly changed direction, with an abrupt movement, making a louder noise, a sort of beat. Then, listing slightly to one side, that strange machine shot off like a bullet towards the south, at such a speed that it was gone from sight in a few seconds. Then I went back to my tractor. I left the craft at roughly 5:30 in the morning, having entered it at 1:15 in the early hours. So I had been there for 4 hours and 15 minutes. A very long time indeed, Ibit. It was all over. The aliens had come and gone. Or, at least, one of them had, thanks to Villas-Boas, that good stallion. It was an event that the man himself, who went on to become a well-respected lawyer, maintained happened exactly as he described it until his dying day, which happened to be in 1992, at the unfortunately very young age of only 58, Ibid. Just as is the case with the accounts of Truman Bathurum, Antonio Villas-Boas's is one that requires us to almost suspend belief. On the other hand, consider these two factors: 1. The fiery red hair of Villas-Boas' space woman was, and is, typical of the red-haired Celtic people, and, 2. Throughout all of South America, the highest levels of people who are type O negative just happen to be the Brazilians. One has to wonder, was Antonio Villas-Boas type O negative? If he was, perhaps this explains why he was chosen, to mate with a being that was also type O negative and who may, herself, have been born out of alien gene tampering. Breakfast with the aliens. In April 1961, a UFO encounter occurred in Wisconsin that many researchers of the flying saucer phenomenon have seen fit to relegate to the domains of hoaxing and fantasy. It just might have been something else, something that takes us back to those enigmatic entities of the Isle of Man and Celtic lore. It was the morning of April 18th, and the breakfast of a man named Joe Simonton was about to be rudely interrupted by visitors from another world. A chicken farmer, Simonton was sitting down to eat when he was shaken by the thundering sound of what he thought was a military plane, flying low overhead. It was not. He raced outside and was confronted by an honest-to-goodness flying saucer, about 30 feet in diameter, hovering above his yard. Simonton could only stand and stare, in awe, as a doorway opened and a trio of men exited the craft and approached him. They were all short in height, about 5 feet, and wore outfits similar to military jumpsuits. One of the three approached Simonton with what clearly resembled a terrestrial jug, and managed to make Simonton understand that he wanted water. Simonton quickly obliged. As a thank you, the aliens gave Simonton a plate of what appeared to be small pancakes. It was a good trade-off for the farmer. The leader of the group gave a strange salute, and the three returned to the craft and shot away, into the heavens. Simonton ate his pancakes, or, at least, he ate one of them, apparently finding it pretty unappetizing. There's absolutely no doubt that just as is the case with the affair of Truman Bethurem, the story of Joe Simonton stretches credulity not just to the limit but, some would surely say, way past it. But, the tale is not quite over. Simonton wasted no time in calling the police, which is, perhaps, an unlikely thing a hoaxer would consider doing. In no time, the U.S. Air Force was in on the action, too, as was the media. Interestingly, the Air Force concluded that Simonton had not concocted the story for money, attention, or infamy, but that he had experienced it in a strange, dreamlike state. And there's one other thing, too. I mentioned that Simonton only ate one of the pancakes. Simonton's decision to preserve the remaining pancakes was a wise one. The Air Force had its scientists analyze one. The result of the analysis demonstrated just one anomaly. The pancake was identical to any other pancake, except for one thing: it was totally lacking in salt. Two of the main ingredients in pancakes are milk and eggs. A cup of the former contains approximately 100 milligrams of sodium. It was never explained how, if Simonton was responsible for the whole thing, even if in an altered state, rather than engaging in deception, he had managed to remove the salt from the pancakes, to the point where not even a single molecule of salt could be found. The skeptic might say, so what? Well, it turns out that in fairy lore, the little people cannot abide salt. In addition, legend says, if a person scatters salt grains on the ground in front of a fairy, he or she has no choice but to count every single grain, a tedious task, to say the least. So, what we have with the case of Joe Simonton is an encounter with a group of relatively small humanoids who had an aversion to salt. Fairies, aliens, or are they one and the same? We daren't go a-hunting, for fear of little men. It's important to note that Joe Simonton's account is not a standalone one. Walter Yealing Evans Wentz was an authority on fairy lore and the author of a still-cherished 1911 book, The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. He told an intriguing story that somewhat parallels that of Joe Simonton. It revolved around an Irishman, Pat Feeney, who received a strange visit from a diminutive woman asking for oatmeal. Evans Wentz said, Patty had so little that he was ashamed to offer it, so he offered her some potatoes instead, but she wanted oatmeal, and then he gave her all that he had. She told him to place it back in the bin till she should return for it. This he did, and the next morning the bin was overflowing with oatmeal. The woman was one of the gentry, Evans Wentz, 2004. And also on a similar path, there is the 1850 poem of William Allingham, The Fairies, in which Allingham referenced crispy pancakes as being none other than the food of the fairy folk, or, as he called them, little men. He even made a connection to the curious matter of owls. Allingham's poem begins as follows. Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we daren't go a-hunting, for fear of little men. We folk, good folk, trooping all together, green jacket, red cap, and white owl's feather, down along the rocky shore, some make their home. They live on crispy pancakes of yellow tide foam, some in the reeds of the Black Mountain Lake, with frogs for their watchdogs. All night awake, Allingham, 1850. Allingham also describes what sounds like a classic case of alien abduction and missing time. They stole little Bridget for 7 years long. When she came down again, her friends were all gone. They took her lightly back. Between the night and morrow, they thought that she was fast asleep, but she was dead with sorrow. They have kept her ever since, deep within the lake, on a bed of fig leaves, watching till she wake. Ibid. Poet William Allingham. Extraterrestrials on the airwaves. Then there are the experiences of a young man named Bob Renault, which occurred just 3 months after Joe Simonton's odd encounter. On one particular night in July 1961, Renault picked up an extraordinary message while browsing around the shortwave bands in his small, Massachusetts town, Kiel, 2014. It began with a series of bleeps but was soon replaced by a female voice, which later identified herself as Lineri from the planet Corendor. As was the case in so many contactee-themed cases of the 1950s and 1960s, Renault had repeated and extensive chats with his newfound alien friends, many of which were focused on the aliens' fears that we, the human race, were on the verge of destroying ourselves. Also closely following the trend of so many contactees, Lineri and her comrades took Renault on trips to secret, alien installations and taught him to create complex machines, one of which was somewhat akin to an old-style television set. It reportedly allowed Renault to see Lineri in the flesh, so to speak. She was a ravishing blonde, who looked to be about 19 years of age, but who claimed to be closer to her mid-70s in human years. A never-aging Anunnaki, perhaps. It's not unreasonable to suggest that this could all have been provoked by nothing stranger than the late-night, hormone-driven fantasies of a young man run wild. But, as with the equally controversial sagas of Truman Bethurem and Joe Simonton, there is something that makes Bob Renault's story highly relevant to the book you are now reading. The name Lineri is very similar to the Gaelic word lion hericht, which is pronounced Linerich and translates into English as abundance, Strieber, 1987. On top of that, even the name of the aliens' alleged home planet, Corendor, is worth commenting on. It's a word very similar if not near identical to the Gaelic Cor Endur, which means Mound of Endur, or, as Whitley Strieber described it, a place of oracle, Ibid. From Finland to flying saucers. Betty Andreasson is someone who has had a lifetime of profound interaction with other world entities. On one occasion in the 1960s, when Andreasson was deep in channeling-style conversation with a small, large-headed alien being named Quayasga, a curious statement was made to Andreasson in a language that she could not understand. One person did understand it, however, a man named Leonard Keane. Listening to audio recordings of Andreasson relating the statement word for word, he concluded the alien was speaking in a form of ancient Gaelic, which translated to the following: the living descendants of the northern peoples are groping in universal darkness. Their mother mourns. A dark occasion forebodes when weakness in high places will revive a high cost of living, an interval of mistakes in high places, an interval fit for distressing events, Strieber, 1988. Betty Andreasson had no awareness of the Gaelic tongue. In fact, she was of Finnish-English origin. It turns out, rather notably, that the Finnish people have higher than normal levels of Rh negatives in their midst. What both this chapter and the preceding one tell us is something of infinite importance, that a study of certain 20th century UFO incidents demonstrates connections to the world of the ancient Celts, to people with Y chromosomes that turn out to be, as the University College London noted, indistinguishable from those of the Basque people, and who are clearly Cro-Magnon-like, and to suggestive links to the Anunnaki. On top of that, Betty Andreasson's associations with Finland, and Antonio Villas-Boas's Brazilian connections to countries with high percentages of Rh negatives cannot be ignored. Nor can the fact that there are notable cases on record where alien visitations and ancient Celtic terminology go together hand in glove, Furcon, Oraines, Corendor, and Lineri being just four of many examples. There is also the fact that both the Bethurem and the Villas-Boas cases had clear and undeniable sexual and reproductive aspects to them. Certain portions of the Celtic-themed Bob Renault affair of 1961 simmered with sexual and sensual suggestion, as do Celtic fairy encounters of centuries past. It's appropriate to close this chapter with the words of Whitley Strieber, who says of the Celtic Gaelic/UFO connection, "It almost begins to seem as if what we are witnessing now is the discovery of an age-old relationship between ourselves and something that has always been completely misunderstood." Strieber, 1987. 13. The arrival of the abductors. The accounts of both Truman Bethurem and Antonio Villas-Boas were reported quite widely in UFO-themed books, magazines, and newsletters in decades past. It was, however, the overtly sexual nature of the claims that led many researchers of the UFO phenomenon to ignore, or completely write off, the cases as fanciful tales born out of fantasy, wishful thinking, and not a lot else. That situation changed post-September 19, 1961. That was the night when what is widely considered to be a downright historic UFO encounter occurred. It was nowhere near as sexually driven as the Villas-Boas case, but it did have an important, human reproductive angle to it. This was something that undeniably set the scene for what followed later, namely, extensive research suggesting that an alien-human breeding program not only existed millennia ago, but continues to exist, despite the apparent exit of the Anunnaki, or the vast majority of them, thousands of years ago. If the Anunnaki did, ultimately, leave our world for their ill-fated, degrading home planet, then how, precisely, might just such a program be continued, without their ongoing presence? As noted earlier, there is a distinct possibility the Anunnaki may have left behind them a veritable army of what we might call biological drones, caretakers created, crafted, and programmed to perform specific tasks including overseeing a long-term, genetic manipulation of humankind, while their godlike overlords remain absent from view. The aforementioned date of September 19, 1961, specifically that night, was when a New Hampshire husband and wife, Barney and Betty Hill, were driving to their New Hampshire home after taking a welcome vacation in Montreal, Canada. One might argue they needed another vacation after experiencing what was lurking and looming on the horizon. Kidnappers from above. As the pair headed home, and at around 10:30 p.m., as they drove south of Lancaster, New Hampshire, they were puzzled by the sight of a strange light in the night sky above. Viewing the lighted object through binoculars convinced the Hills that what they were seeing was not an aircraft of either a commercial or military kind. As they continued their drive through the mountains, Barney and Betty developed an uneasy sense that whoever was flying the craft was specifically watching them, playing a game with them, toying with them, and practically goading them into following the maneuvers of the mysterious vehicle. Matters came to a sudden hair-raising head when the object approached their car and dropped to a height of around 90 feet, causing a terrified Barney to bring the car to a sudden stop, in the middle of the road, on the darkened, mountain pass. Pancake-like was how Barney later described the unearthly-looking vehicle, after stepping out of the car and staring into the dark skies. As Barney focused on the craft with the binoculars, he couldn't fail to see close to a dozen beings wearing caps milling around and peering down at the now deeply frightened pair. When the machine began to close in on the Hills' car, Barney shouted to Betty that the things inside were going to kidnap them. They jumped back into the car and sped off at high speed, which is hardly surprising. Craft and crew did not follow, or so it seemed at the time. Hypnosis, buried memories, and probing for pregnancy. The traumatic encounter was far from over. It didn't take long at all before Betty and Barney realized that there was something very wrong about their journey. About 2 hours of time was missing from it. Gone. Obliterated from their memories. Finally, after nightmares, restless nights of tossing and turning, and picking up on fragmented memories suggesting there was far more to the incident than they consciously remembered, the pair received help from a psychiatrist and neurologist in Boston, Massachusetts, Dr. Benjamin Simon, who began a series of hypnotic sessions with the Hills in January 1964. What surfaced out of those sessions, while Barney and Betty were rendered into altered states by the doctor, was, to put it bluntly, astounding. If the results of the hypnosis were not the product of fantasy or suggestion, both of the Hills had been taken aboard what was nothing less than an alien spacecraft and subjected to a number of medical procedures that clearly left Betty and Barney in states of lasting turmoil. One of those procedures specifically performed on Betty gave an indication that human reproduction somehow played a role in the matter. And something that Barney reported, it will soon be revealed, has a major bearing on the Rh-negative issue. The modern era of alien abductions, and that attendant matter of a connection to human reproduction and an alien bloodline, was about to be born. The story is a remarkable one, and one that is comprised of Betty's and Barney's own memories that flooded back into their mind during distressing dreams, as well as data that surfaced during the hypnosis sessions with Dr. Simon. We'll start with Betty. According to Betty, while under the control and sway of the strange creatures that stood before her on the craft, she experienced something deeply traumatic. Laid out flat on something similar to an operating table, Betty to her horror witnessed one of the entities inserting a needle-like device into her navel, after informing her he was going to check if she was pregnant. In addition, Betty said the alien performing the procedure assured her that the test would be very helpful, but in what way, and why, exactly, were not explained. Nor was it explained who the procedure would be helpful for, Betty or the ETS. One suspects the latter. According to Betty, the needle was somewhere between 4 and 6 inches in length and had a tube attached to it. Far from feeling like the slight discomfort associated with a regular medical needle, however, Betty said that the pain as it was inserted was more along the lines of what she thought it would feel like to have the blade of a knife plunged into her. In other words, it was excruciating. Both the entity carrying out the task, and an additional one that was perceived by the Hills as the leader, reacted in a surprised and concerned fashion, to the extent that the creature overseeing the situation waved his hand across Betty's eyes, something that immediately removed all of the agony. At least, that was the scenario in Betty's dreams. Under hypnosis, however, the story was that the pain did not go away. Betty was still in pain and deeply stressed. This is highly suggestive of the probability that her subconscious state had attempted to place a more positive, and far less dramatic, slant on the experience, but one that the hypnosis sessions demonstrated was far worse than her mind was trying to telling her. In fact, such was the stressful, pain-filled, and fear-dominated state that Betty was in, Dr. Simon took the immediate step of bringing the hypnotic session to a rapid halt. This particular aspect of the Hill affair brings us to the matter of something called amniocentesis. An alien equivalent of amniocentesis? When a woman becomes pregnant, the developing fetus is enveloped in what is termed amniotic fluid. It is a liquid that is very much like water, and from a study of which a great deal can be ascertained about the health and development of the fetus. Alpha-fetoprotein and developing skin cells are two of the main things that the amniocentesis procedure focuses on, as it seeks to confirm the condition of the fetus. During the process, a needle is inserted into the mother's uterus, via her abdomen, usually between 15 and 18 weeks into pregnancy. Because the procedure can at times be a tricky one, it is constantly overseen via ultrasound scanning. The goal is to use the needle to secure a small amount of amniotic fluid, which can then be studied and analyzed. Typically, the procedure is performed for genetic reasons, such as to determine if the developing baby may have muscular dystrophy, cystic fibrosis, or Down syndrome. It's a procedure which is very often undertaken on women in their mid-30s or older, and who have a markedly higher chance of developing chromosomal disorders, and those who have given birth to a previous child with either physical or mental disorders. It may not be a coincidence that when Betty was subjected to that curious procedure, she was already in her early 40s. The unborn human fetus. Rather notably, one of the risks associated with amniocentesis is directly connected to the matter of the Rh negatives. During the process of utilizing a needle to secure skin cells and alpha-fetoprotein from the fetus, blood cells from the baby may enter the bloodstream of the mother. If mother and baby have the same blood, there is no problem. If, however, the mother is Rh negative and the child is not, Rh sensitization will occur and the mother's body will immediately begin creating antibodies to attack the fetus's blood cells. Only by giving the mother the drug Rh immunoglobulin can the baby be free of attack from its very own parent. Amniocentesis or something else. It must be said that there is one notable difference between amniocentesis and the procedure that Betty Hill experienced, namely, that the needle inserted into Betty went via her navel. In amniocentesis, it's via the abdomen and then into the uterus. Nevertheless, it's still astonishing that Betty's aliens informed her that the needle inserting procedure was linked with determining if she was pregnant. Those doubtful of Betty's account might take note of the fact that in 1930, the team of Leland E. Hawley, Thomas Orville Muniz, and J. Duane Miller, performed an amniocentesis procedure on a pregnant woman. In this case, it involved injecting dye into the amniotic sac, specifically to study the placenta and the fetus. It was also used, as far back as the 1950s, to determine if an Rh-negative woman was carrying an Rh-positive baby. It was, however, a procedure that remained extremely dicey until the early 1970s, when the introduction of ultrasound technology was applied to the process of securing alpha-fetoprotein and skin cells. Could Betty have heard of, or read about, these early, pre-1960s era examples of amniocentesis? Certainly, it's not impossible. In addition, in 1960, only 1 year before the encounter of the Hills, and for the very first time, amniocentesis was used to identify hemophilia-related issues relative to mother and fetus. It was a development reported on, at the time though primarily in the pages of in-house medical journals, of a type that Betty was unlikely to have come across. If Betty did have an awareness of what amniocentesis is, it's not impossible that buried memories of reading about it had a bearing on both her dream-based and hypnotic recollections. But, on the other hand, why would Betty say the needle was inserted into her navel, if she knew that amniocentesis was a technique that was focused only on the abdomen and the uterus? In some respects, what Betty told of sounds far more like a laparoscopy, in which a small insertion is made into the belly and a lighted tube is inserted to allow for an examination of the pelvic organs to be undertaken. Given that the pelvic organs include the uterus, the fallopian tubes, the vagina, and the ovaries, a solid case can still be made that the procedure performed on Betty was specifically of a gynecological nature, even if it wasn't a case of amniocentesis. The strange story of Barney's spine. Having addressed one of the most significant procedures performed on Betty Hill, let's take a look at two experiences reported by her husband, Barney, both of which have a bearing on the overall story that this book tells. At one point, while Barney was being medically examined, one of the entities placed something over his penis that caused him to orgasm and ejaculate. The inference is that the aliens wished to obtain a sample of Barney's sperm. There then followed a much stranger procedure. One of the creatures carefully ran its fingers down the entire length of Barney's spine. So carefully and precisely was the action taken, Barney came to suspect the alien was counting how many vertebrae Barney had. This might sound odd, at first glance. Upon taking a second look, however, there may have been a very good reason for performing a task that many might find downright peculiar or even unnecessary. About 1 in 10 of the world's population is born with an extra, 6th lumbar vertebra. What is particularly interesting, however, is that the percentage of Rh negatives with an additional vertebra is significant. With this in mind, one could make a logical assumption that the alien in question was trying to determine if Barney was Rh negative. It's also worth noting that although most people associate the experience of the Hills with the so-called diminutive, skinny, hairless, large-headed, and black-eyed greys of alien abduction lore, the fact is that Betty described the entities as having dark hair, pronounced foreheads, and large noses that reminded her of the nose of Jimmy Durante. For those who are not aware of who Durante was, he was an Italian-American comedian noted for his huge nose. Interestingly, a careful look at Durante's nose reveals it was not at all dissimilar to that of the Neanderthals, who are part and parcel of the Rh-negative controversy. The pronounced foreheads as described by Betty were also typical of the Neanderthals, as, almost certainly, was the dark hair she described them as having. Should we consider that the aliens encountered by Barney and Betty Hill, late one night in September 1961, had a lineage extending back to the days of the Cro-Magnons, the Neanderthals, and the DNA-manipulating Anunnaki? Maybe, yes. Barney Hill died in 1969, he was only 46 years of age. Betty lived on until 2004, when she passed on at the ripe old age of 85. As a result, many aspects of the Hill case elude us and are likely to continue to do so. It should, however, be kept firmly in mind that, 1. A procedure was performed on Betty that was not unlike amniocentesis, which, as we have seen, can have a bearing on issues concerning an Rh-negative, pregnant woman carrying an Rh-positive fetus, and, 2. Steps were taken to count Barney's lumbar vertebra, something that may well be related to the matter of many Rh-negatives having an extra vertebra. Many investigators of the UFO phenomenon perceive the Hill case as one of the most important cases on record from a historical perspective and from the angle of it being the first, high-profile example of alien abduction. The incident may also be significant from the undeniable, but until now largely unappreciated, connection to the domain of the Rh-negatives. 14. The abduction epidemic begins. If the September 1961 incident reported by Barney and Betty Hill had been a one-off, singular event, then there might be at least some justification in suggesting that the whole event was born out of some strange, shared psychological event. It was not a singular event, however. Quite the contrary, it was just the start of a veritable deluge of reports that continues to this very day. Somewhat curiously, although abductions increased post-1961, in the immediate years after the experience of the Hills, the sexual and reproduction aspects were very much few and far between. Take, for example, the case of one Herbert Schirmer. In the early hours of December 3, 1967, Schirmer, a policeman in Ashland, Nebraska, was driving around town, checking that all was normal. It turns out that things were not normal. They were far from being normal. As he scoured the deserted, quiet streets, Schirmer was suddenly confronted by what, at first glance, he thought was a broken-down truck at the edge of one particular road. When his headlights hit the object with full force, however, it became instantly clear to Schirmer that this was no truck. What Schirmer was confronted by was a fairly compact, egg-shaped vehicle, floating around 8 to 10 feet above the surface of the road. An amazed Schirmer could only stare with amazement as the UFO, there was really no other way to describe it, rose further into the sky, amid a flashing of red lights and a wailing, banshee-like sound, and then exited the area by taking a course directly above Schirmer's vehicle. He sat there, amazed, for a few moments, and then quickly headed back to the police station. He feverishly recorded the details in the logbook. Saw a flying saucer at the junction of Highways 6 and 63. Believe it or not. Bloom and Bloom, 1978. Just like Betty and Barney Hill, Schirmer very soon came to realize that certain portions of that strange night were gone from his mind and memory, specifically, an hour or so of time. Also paralleling the Hills experience, Schirmer elected to undergo hypnosis to try to figure out what on earth, or off of it, had occurred. The hypnotic sessions were carried out by a Boulder, Colorado-based Dr. Leo Sprinkle. While under hypnosis, Schirmer provided an incredible account of what happened during that absent period of time. Taken aboard a UFO. As he sat in his police car, staring in awe at the hovering craft directly before him, Schirmer was confronted by three beings, all wearing tight-fitting, one-piece outfits, that exited the craft and walked toward him. All were around 4.5 to 5 feet in height. Approaching the driver's side window, one which Schirmer perceived to be the leader of the alien pack leaned in a slightly menacing fashion, and asked, "Are you the watchman of this place?" Schirmer replied that, yes, he was. As the aliens stood around his squad car, Schirmer couldn't fail to notice that their uniforms displayed, rather intriguingly, the image of a winged serpent. The matter of winged serpents is highly significant to the saga of the Aztec and Toltec god Quetzalcoatl, related in a later chapter of this book, who may very well have been one of the legendary Anunnaki, Ibid. Quetzalcoatl, the serpent god. Schirmer was reportedly taken aboard the craft, given what we would call a tour, and told, in somewhat puzzling and enigmatic words, by the head alien, We want you to believe in us, but not too much." After this, he was returned to his vehicle, with his mind wiped clean of the events until definitively bad dreams forced him to undergo hypnosis, and the startling saga came tumbling out in spectacular fashion. Ibid. Kidnapped from the Pascagoula River. Moving on to 1973, specifically the night of October 10th, there is the fantastic report of Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson, who, on the night at issue, were having a fine, relaxing time fishing on the banks of the Pascagoula River, Mississippi. It was roughly 9 p.m. when the attention of both men was caught by a curious light coming across the waters of the river and in their very direction. As the light closed in, Hickson and Parker could see it for what it really was, an oval-shaped vehicle that gave off a slight, nausea-inducing hum and an array of dazzling, bright lights. Suddenly, a hatch opened in the side of the craft and 3 figures, all vaguely human in shape, but gray in color, with lobster-like claws, and faces that appeared somewhat masked and displaying carrot-like protrusions, emerged. They glided eerily and silently, across and above the river, right toward the petrified pair. Whether it was due to some unearthly power of the terrifying trio from the stars, or just pure, cold fear on the part of Hickson and Parker, neither man was able to move a muscle. They were like the proverbial deer caught in the proverbial headlights. The creatures lunged for both men, who were quickly taken aboard the craft. Hickson's book explains that according to Parker, as he lay on some kind of table, a female entity inserted a needle into the base of his penis shades, of course, of Betty Hill's story of her aliens inserting a needle into her navel. When the procedure was over, both men, groggy and unsure what had just happened, were unceremoniously deposited back on the edge of the river, from where they had originally been taken. It was an incident that led Parker to retreat into a world of anonymity, and Hickson to write a book on the affair and become a celebrity on the UFO lecture circuit. Trauma in the Woods. 2 years after the Hickson-Parker incident, on the night of November 5, 1975, it was the turn of a man named Travis Walton to be kidnapped, in dramatic fashion, from a logging site in the Apache Sagreves National Forest, in Arizona. As terrified colleagues looked on, Walton was hit by a bright light that emanated from a significantly sized, gold-colored UFO that had caught the group's attention and that Walton had raced toward. His friends fled the scene when Walton was hit by the beam and, incredibly, rose slightly off the ground. Walton was neither seen nor heard from for another 5 days. On his return, Walton told a story that was as fantastic as it was controversial. Like so many other alien abductees, Walton's next recollection, after the cosmic confrontation in the woods, was of waking up on a bed-like structure, around which was a trio of small figures, with large heads and piercing eyes. There followed a near-violent confrontation between Walton and the 3, an encounter with a being that looked practically human, and an experience with a female alien who placed something over Walton's mouth and face that most closely resembled a gas mask. After that, there was nothing, at least, not until he awoke, groggy and confused, in the town of Heber, Arizona. Decades later, the story of Travis Walton continues to be debated amid those places where ufologists gather. That, in essence, is a summary of several of the most prominent alien abduction cases that occurred in both the immediate and long-term wake of the Betty and Barney Hill incident of September 1961. Of those cases, the only one with a semblance of a sexual/reproductive component attached to it was that of Calvin Parker. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, however, there was a dramatic and sudden shift and increase in the number of alien abductions reported, and particularly so across the United States, nearly all of which were dominated by matters relative to eggs, sperm, gene splicing, and the birth of what have become known as alien-human hybrids. 15. Missing time. The person who largely and almost single-handedly kick-started the next aspect of the story of genetic manipulation of the human race by advanced extraterrestrials was a Virginia-born painter named Bud Hopkins. It was Hopkins's 1981 book, Missing Time, that really set the cat among the pigeons, as we shall now see. The abduction stories of Betty and Barney Hill, Travis Walton, Herbert Schirmer, and Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were undeniably fascinating, and they most assuredly made the UFO research community sit up and take notice of something astounding. People were being kidnapped and subjected to intrusive and frightening medical procedures by creatures from other worlds. There is, however, an important issue that needs to be stressed, and that demonstrates how and why the sheer scale of the alien abduction phenomenon remained underappreciated until Hopkins was on the scene. The Hill case occurred in 1961. Herbert Schirmer was taken on board a UFO in 1967. Hickson and Parker's abduction was in 1973. And Travis Walton was taken in 1975. That's just 4 cases across 14 years. Yes, there were other, less well-profiled, abductions throughout that time period, but the image that these incidents provoked was one that suggested abductions were things that occurred only now and again. It was not a case of aliens routinely abducting people on a regular basis, all across the planet. Well, actually it was. It was Hopkins, whose abduction research began in 1976, that we have to thank for demonstrating that what appeared to be a few random events was actually nothing of the sort. It was a downright epidemic. Tagging, tracking, and taking something. More disturbing, Hopkins's work showed that, in many cases, abductions did not begin when people matured and were adults. They commenced in the formative years of childhood and very often ran through numerous generations of the same families. In some cases, Hopkins found, people were being implanted with small devices for purposes that no one could ascertain. Maybe they were designed to tag people, allowing the ETS to track the abductees throughout their lives, no matter where they might relocate to on the planet. A far more sinister theory suggested that the implants were designed to do nothing less than alter the behavior of the abductees. In no time at all, the somewhat innocent days of Betty and Barney Hill were overthrown by fears of alien-orchestrated Manchurian candidates and hypnotically controlled abductees. Bud Hopkins, author of Missing Time. Hopkins's early work, as published in Missing Time in 1981, also sowed the seeds for something else, a deep and nagging suspicion that part of the alien abduction agenda and, just perhaps, all of it was based around matters of a reproductive, genetic nature. Hopkins asked of this issue, what if the UFO occupants are taking something from their captives? Hopkins, 1981. He answered his own question with the following words, "We may indeed possess something, a natural resource, an element, a genetic structure that an alien culture might desire to use, for example, as raw material, ibid." Hopkins may well have been right on target with his references to a genetic structure and raw material, both of which hark back to the days of the Anunnaki and their widespread alteration of the human species. Hopkins's book proved to be a major talking point within the field of ufology and firmly set the scene for what was to follow, ibid. Intruders and Communion. Bud Hopkins continued to intensively investigate alien abduction claims in the 1980s, and to the extent that a clear pattern of DNA fingerprinting, the extraction of ova and sperm from abductees, and suspicions of a massive, alien-driven operation to use the human race in some huge, genetics-driven program, took firm shape. In 1987, matters really came to a head. Hopkins's follow-up book, Intruders, was published, which told the story of alien abductee Kathy Davies. It was a book that reinforced the scenarios detailed in Missing Time. By far the most important development in the alien abduction phenomenon in 1987, however, was the publication of Whitley Strieber's huge bestseller Communion. Strieber, previously known for such horror fiction novels as The Wolfen and The Hunger, told an incredible story of a traumatic December 1985 experience of definitive alien abduction proportions. Not only that, Strieber's book was quite unlike anything else that had, up until that point, ever been published on the abduction controversy. Yes, Communion demonstrated that Strieber had undergone something that fitted the abduction template. But, he also veered off into territories that few UFO researchers had previously negotiated. In researching his own experiences, Strieber came across data that demonstrated a connection between the names and language of certain alien entities and the Celtic people of times long gone, as noted in a previous chapter. Strieber also began to dig deep into ancient fairy lore, noting for his readers the undeniable parallels between encounters with the little people and today's Greys, and with the missing time angle being one of the most visible and obvious of all the parallels. He also delved deep into the curious connection between alien encounters and owls, the latter being a staple part of the lore surrounding the Anunnaki Lilith. At the time, however, many within ufology, galvanized by the words of Hopkins, wanted to hear solely about implants, spaceships, and creatures from other planets engaging in bizarre experiments on targeted people. Yes, Communion covered all those points that so excited and enthused the UFO research community. But, Strieber was astute enough to realize that even if that was exactly what was taking place, it did not tell the entire story. What Strieber did in his book was to demonstrate in a soundly argued fashion that the alien abduction phenomenon is not a recent one. It did not begin with Betty and Barney Hill, or even with Antonio Villas-Boas. It was as old as us, the human race, and probably much older, infinitely older. Strieber's 1988 follow-up book, Transformation, added to the controversy, as did subsequent titles, such as The Secret School and Breakthrough. Strieber's collective work did something else, too. It caught the attention of the mainstream media. After all, how could it not? Communion hit the #1 spot on the New York Times bestseller list. By the end of the 1980s, and as a new decade loomed large, tales of alien abductions, and matters relative to stolen sperm, purloined ova, and strange devices buried under people's skin, were everywhere. A Harvard professor gets on the trail of the abductors. The 1990s saw the alien abduction phenomenon reach positively stratospheric proportions. Much of this was a result of the work of two men, John E. Mack MD, and David M. Jacobs, Ph.D. It must be said, however, that they brought very different concepts and thoughts to the table. Mack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, of a book on T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who was killed in 2004, in London, England, by a drunk driver, penned two books that left a big mark on 1990s era ufology, Abduction and Passport to the Cosmos. Certainly, one of the chief reasons why Mack's books became such talking points wasn't just because of their subject matter. It was because Mack was a Harvard Medical School professor and he was talking about alien abductions from the perspective of them being all too shockingly real. Needless to say, none of this went down well with the bigwigs at Harvard, and in May 1994 Mack's work in the field of alien abductions came under rapid, unrelenting fire. The result, Daniel C. Tosteson, who was the dean of the Harvard Medical School, set up a group to carefully assess the nature of clinical care given by Mack to his growing body of abductees. The conclusions of the group were damning. Mack's attorney, Daniel Sheehan, said that Tosteson's group concluded that it was professionally irresponsible for any academic, scholar or practicing psychiatrist to give any credence whatsoever to any personal report of a direct personal contact between a human being and an extraterrestrial being until after the person has been subjected to every possible available battery of standard psychological tests which might conceivably explain the report as the product of some known form of clinical psychosis. To communicate, in any way whatsoever, to a person who has reported a close encounter with an extraterrestrial life form that this experience might well have been real is professionally irresponsible. Class, 1995. Nevertheless, Mack retained his standing at Harvard and continued his abduction-based work until the time of his death in London. Where Mack differed from so many other UFO researchers that were studying the phenomenon was from the perspective of the spiritual nature of certain abduction events. Mack held the view that there was a deep spiritual aspect to the mystery and that people were transformed in a positive fashion by their experiences. He noted, for example, that post-abduction they often developed concerns about the environment. They pondered the matter of life after death, karma, and fate, and the nature of the human soul, and they underwent out-of-body experiences and near-death events from which they came back positively transformed. Mack said, "The abduction phenomenon seems to me to be a part of the shift in consciousness that is collapsing duality and enabling us to see that we are connected beyond the earth at a cosmic level." Mack, 1999. And then there was Professor David M. Jacobs. Creating something that looks human but isn't. Before we get to the matter of Jacobs, it is both important and relevant to note that the 1990s was also the decade in which another aspect of alien abduction lore reached its absolute pinnacle. It was the matter of what have become known as alien-human hybrids. Certainly, both the Antonio Villas-Boas case of 1957 and the Betty and Barney Hill encounter of 1961 strongly suggested there was what we might call a reproductive component to abductions. Bud Hopkins's work, showing that ova and sperm were being taken from kidnapped Americans, reinforced that particular theory even more. All of that, however, was overshadowed by the rise of the hybrids. As the 1990s progressed, controversial, and even frightening, accounts surfaced of alien abductees encountering usually on board UFOs young children that gave every appearance of being half human and half alien, and specifically of the gray type. They looked human, but there were certain things that were just not right. Their skin was pale, almost to the point of appearing anemic. Their limbs were thin, bony, and fragile looking. Their eyes were overly large, and noticeably oval or almond-shaped, exactly like those of the Greys. Their hair was thin and wispy. And it wasn't just hybrid children that abductees reported encountering, it was hybrid fetuses, too. In many such cases, witnesses claimed to have seen such fetuses being grown in huge, glass tanks filled with milky liquid. The implication was, for some, terrifying, aliens, from who knew where, were creating and refining creatures that resembled us, providing one did not get too close a look at them, that could pass for us, that could move among us, and that might even have an agenda of infiltrating us. And yes, I do mean that from a sinister, and potentially hostile, perspective. There is something else too. The hybrids were the undeniable modern-day equivalents of the so-called changelings of centuries-old Celtic lore concerning fairies, things created by the wee folk and that were designed to replace babies snatched in the night and whisked away to the domain of the fairies who, as we have seen, may actually have been creations of the Anunnaki. All of this brings us to Professor Jacobs. The threat. Bud Hopkins was of the opinion that, even if the Greys were exploiting people and taking their DNA, sperm, and eggs, and all against their will, the alien abduction phenomenon was still, essentially, a benign one. John Mack considered the abduction experience to be downright positive and spiritually uplifting, even. Professor Jacobs, however, had a very different line of thought, and he still does. The author of, among other titles, The Threat, revealing the secret alien agenda, Jacobs makes no bones about his beliefs. He strongly suspects that the creation of what we might call an underground, alien army is well underway, that something from somewhere else is clandestinely working its way into human civilization, its numbers rising and its intentions bleak. For us, at least. Not for them, of course. Jacobs says, many people think that abductions are a study or experiment, or that the aliens are learning about us. The numbers suggest otherwise. The learning and experimenting, if ever the case, are mainly over. Hence, the evidence clearly indicates that the aliens are conducting a widespread, systematic program of physiological exploitation of human beings, emphasis added, Jacobs, 1999. In the next couple of chapters, let's take a much closer look at the possibly ominous entities that may be among us. Their names include not just the hybrids, but also, and most ominous of all, the black-eyed children. 16. Children of the gods. Reports of so-called hybrid children and hybrid babies are particularly notable, in the sense that encounters with these somewhat unsettling creatures more often than not follow certain, distinct pathways that crop up time and again. There is, for example, most assuredly a greater percentage of female abductees who have had interactions with the hybrids than there are male abductees. There appears to be a very good reason for this. Under hypnotic regression, numerous women have reported being taken aboard a UFO or, on more than a few occasions, to an underground installation, where they are introduced to the hybrids. Of course, the underground component parallels the centuries-old fairy encounters and the changeling phenomenon, as discussed in an earlier chapter. In such situations the woman will either be laying on something akin to an operating room table, or sitting in a chair that resembles a dentist's chair. It's then that something remarkable happens, although, admittedly, others might call it utterly terrifying. The world of the hybrids. As the abductee looks on, a group of 3 or 4 greys will approach, with one of them holding in their hands a tiny baby that is clearly not entirely human, even though it exhibits certain physical, human traits. The abductee is then encouraged to take the baby from the grey and to cradle it. Researchers of the phenomenon have suggested, probably correctly, that this procedure is undertaken to try to instill an emotional bond between the abductee and the hybrid. If this all sounds very calm and tranquil, it very often is the precise opposite. Many of the female abductees who report this bonding process or attempt at bonding were, months earlier, pregnant themselves. For a while, at least, they were. There are many reports on record where a pregnant abductee has experienced a sudden, unexplained miscarriage, a tragic event, to be sure. Or is there just an assumption they were miscarriages? Quite possibly, yes. Those same abductees, when presented with a hybrid baby, develop sudden, unexplained suspicions that what they are being shown is the baby they were once carrying and that they assumed had miscarried. In this scenario, abduction researchers suggest, the abductees are impregnated during an earlier abduction, they then carry the fetus for a number of months, and then it is removed from the mother during a later abduction and essentially grown in what we might call an artificial womb. A sensational, some might say outrageous scenario, to be sure, but it's not a possibility that can be dismissed. The reason why it is as amazing as it is controversial, we, the human race, are now working hard and fast to develop artificial wombs. Giving birth without actually giving birth. The process of growing a fetus, and bringing it to full term in an artificial womb, is called ectogenesis. Much of the research is still at a theoretical stage, predominantly because of moral-based restrictions and regulations that govern the ethical, or non-ethical, use of human embryos in experimentation. But, not all of the work is theoretical. As just 2 perfect examples, we have to first turn our attentions to Japan and experimentation undertaken in 1997 at the Bunkyo, Tokyo-based Juntendo University. The program was led by Yoshinori Kawabara, the chairman of the Department of Obstetrics at the university, who was successful in growing goat embryos that were contained in a machine filled with amniotic fluid, a yellow-colored liquid contained in the amniotic sac and that surrounds the growing fetus. Then there is the work of Cornell University's Reproductive Endocrine Laboratory. In both 2003 and 2011 significant success was had by sustaining embryos in artificial wombs. In the 2003 experiment, the embryo was that of a mouse. 8 years later, however, it was nothing less than a human embryo, which was allowed to develop for 10 days, with 14 days being the absolute, legal time limit on experimenting with human fetuses. Zoltan Istvan, the founder of the Transhumanist Party, says of a theoretical future in which human babies are no longer birthed but grown almost in conveyor belt style. The theory is that every heartbeat, kick, and moment of a fetus's life could be carefully monitored, from zygote to the moment the baby takes its first breath of air. Every nutrient the fetus gets would be measured, every movement it makes would be filmed, every heartbeat would be analyzed for proper timing. As with all new technology, traditional biological and social customs could give way to newer practices promising safety, efficiency, and practicality. Mejia, 2014. In that sense, the process of effectively leaving the mother out of the equation, and having the 9-month-long process of development handled in an artificial womb, may offer notable advantages. There is, however, one potential disadvantage, and it may prove to be a big one, should we, as a species, ever decide to go down this cold, emotionless pathway. It is the matter of the deep bonding between the mother and the unborn fetus that quickly develops when pregnancy begins, or, in the future, what might very well be a distinct lack of that bonding. Might we see a 23rd century, or a 28th century, in which, as a result of a factory-like environment in which babies are created to order, specification, and design, that bond is completely lost? Might we see the human race, hundreds of years from now, reduced to nothing but cold, emotionless entities, in fact, just like the Greys, rather ironically, that will have no understanding of, or even any care for, the emotional angle of what it means to be pregnant? Such a thing, given that research in this field is pressing ahead, is not at all out of the question. It may be sadly inevitable. This same situation may also explain why the Greys are forced to present hybrid children to human mothers. In an effort to induce bonding, the Greys are utterly incapable of comprehending how to make that bond themselves. And on this very matter, we have reports from abductees that are downright eerie, in terms of their descriptions of what appear to be artificial wombs aboard UFOs and in below-ground facilities. Professor David Jacobs provides data that is undeniably chilling, and that is based on his first-hand work with many victims of alien abduction and genetic manipulation. Abductees have reported rooms, some small and some almost cavernous, containing hundreds, and even thousands, of tanks with gestating fetuses, their large, open black eyes dominating their tiny bodies. The tanks are often arrayed in gestational stages of development, from youngest to oldest. Jacobs, 1999. Jacobs says of one abductee he worked with, Allison, that a gray alien told Allison that late-stage fetuses are kept longer in utero because they cannot be sustained in incubators for a long time. Early-stage hybrids, he said, can be kept in the incubators for more sustained periods. Ibid. Then there was the late Dr. Roger Leir, who took things to an even more controversial level with his conclusions that some abductees, particularly those who were part of the hybridization process, were being implanted with infinitely small devices that could track their every single move. Leir's website, Alien Scalpel, states of Leir's work that he and his surgical team have performed 15 surgeries on alleged alien abductees. This resulted in the removal of 16 separate and distinct objects suspected of being alien implants. These objects have been scientifically investigated by some of the most prestigious laboratories in the world, including Los Alamos National Labs, New Mexico Tech, Seal Laboratories, Southwest Labs, the University of Toronto, York University, and the University of California at San Diego. Their findings have been baffling, and some comparisons have been made to meteorite samples. In addition, some of the tests show metallurgical anomalies such as highly magnetic iron that is without crystalline form, combinations of crystalline materials, mixed common metals, growth of biological tissue into or out of metallic substances, as well as isotopic ratios not of this world. Dr. Leir's Bio, 2010. Alien Implant Authority, the late Roger Leir. Children that are not what they seem to be. It should be noted that it's not always just hybrid babies that are shown to abductees and with whom they are encouraged to bond. It's very often hybrid children, too. As bizarre as it may sound, or, just perhaps, it's not quite so bizarre. After all, abductees report being taken to rooms that are in stark contrast to the sterile and clean, almost obsessively so, environments aboard UFOs. In these particular cases, abductees enter an environment in which hybrid children are given toys to play with, as if a concerted attempt is being made to humanize the hybrids even more. Whether this is done from a positive perspective of interspecies cooperation and interbreeding, or if it's done to ensure that the hybrids can more successfully infiltrate human society in a sinister, hostile fashion, very much remains to be seen and is dependent on which side of the fence you stand. Take, for example, the story of Jennifer, a lifelong resident of New Jersey. Now 32, she has conscious recall of encounters with the Greys going back to her early childhood, as does her mother. Even her grandmother has vague recollections of encountering a group of little men in New Jersey woods, during the summer months, at some point in the 1940s again, emphasizing the ongoing, multi-generational aspect of these events. As well as her consciously recalled interactions with the Greys, Jennifer has been able to pull further recollections out of the depths of her mind and subconscious via hypnosis. One recollection in particular stands out, in terms of relevancy. Although Jennifer has no memories of interactions with hybrid babies, she does have memories of being taken, in 2009, to what she described as looking like an old military base, but shut down, where she encountered hybrid children. As we will see in a future chapter, there are other examples of abandoned, official facilities seemingly being used in covert abduction-related situations. Jennifer's hypnotically recovered recollections begin with her stepping out of what she first thought was a large, black sedan, but that, with hindsight, she came to believe was a landed UFO. The image of the car, then, being a screen memory designed to mask, or at least confuse, the true nature of the event. She then recalls being guided, in a somewhat groggy and hazy state, to an elevator by three dwarfish figures of which she found difficult to recall, in terms of their physical appearances. What she had no trouble remembering, however, was what happened next. Redfern, interview, 2011. After what she perceived as an incredibly long descent in the elevator, Jennifer was taken to a large room that was filled with two things: a group of 5 or 6 hybrid children, all but one female, and a multitude of toys. Strewn across the floor were teddy bears, dolls, and a large amount of fluffy toy dogs. The hybrids, skinny, sickly looking, yellow-haired, and seemingly disinterested in the toys, were sitting on chairs placed in a row against one of the walls. It was Jennifer's job, as she worded it, to try to encourage the children to play with the toys, something she was only partially successful in doing. 2 of them actually smiled and even laughed when Jennifer gently tossed teddy bears in their direction. The others offered little more than disinterest. Time and again, Jennifer was urged to interact with the hybrids. And on each occasion, the response was far from encouraging. Evidently, Jennifer's abductors realized that things were not proceeding well, and she was finally motioned to the door. Once again, her mind was filled with images of sitting in a black sedan, and being driven back to her home. Yet, as with her arrival at the facility, she had deep suspicions that the car imagery was, effectively, implanted in her mind and did not tell the true story of how she found herself deep underground, Ibid. Jennifer's encounter is of a type that many abductees, particularly so for female abductees, have reported. Although we can hope that the attempts of the Greys to have the hybrids interact with the human race has a positive goal in mind, we should still remain mindful of the conclusions of Professor David Jacobs, namely that what is afoot is a subtle, secret, and sinister program of genetic manipulation, designed to allow for the infiltration, the human race infiltration, that will ultimately lead to nothing less than full-blown control. And from that point onward? Well, the news may be far from good. Are there indications that the hybrids are up to no good? Yes, there certainly are. They are indications that can be found in what is, without doubt, the creepiest development in this ever-expanding saga, the rise of the most terrifying hybrids of all. 17. The Black-Eyed Children. In 1957, an acclaimed British sci-fi writer, John Wyndham, probably best known for his 1951 book, The Day of the Triffids, penned a novel titled The Midwich Cuckoos. In 1960, it was turned into a hit movie called Village of the Damned, which spawned a 1963 sequel, Children of the Damned. The story is one that, in a fictional format, has deep parallels to the real world of UFOs and matters that are highly relevant to the hybrids. In Wyndham's story, on one particular morning, all of the residents of the small English village of Midwich are briefly and inexplicably rendered unconscious. They wake soon after, groggy and confused. Indeed, one can convincingly argue they experienced nothing less than alien abduction, style missing time. All seems normal afterward, despite the utterly baffling nature of the village-wide event. As the tale progresses, however, we learn that things are nowhere near normal. Each and every woman in the village who is capable of giving birth soon finds herself inexplicably pregnant. The pregnancies are not what one would normally expect, however, the fetuses develop at an alarmingly and inexplicably rapid rate. The women all give birth within hours of each other. The babies grow at incredibly fast speeds, taking on the appearance of 7 or 8-year-olds when they are barely actually 3. They are eerily emotionless, have vacant expressions and pale skin, possess eyes that are dominated by jet-black irises, and have the ability to take control of the human mind, in hypnotic-like fashion. Hardly surprisingly, the British government takes a concerned interest, particularly so because similar odd births have been reported in other parts of the world. As the children continue to grow, so do their intellects and their extraordinary psychic powers, to the extent that the adults soon become the slaves, and, eventually, the all-too-dead victims of the creepy kids. As a result, the race is on to wipe out these possibly half-human/half-alien things. Although we are never told this is what they are, the inference is certainly apparent, before they and the others of their kind, specifically in Russia, Canada, and Australia, can exert their murderous tendencies on just about anyone and everyone else. Both the Midwich Cuckoos and the movie adaptation, The Village of the Damned, are made all the more extraordinary and thought-provoking as a result of something undeniably astounding. In the late 1990s, a phenomenon began to slowly surface that suggested John Wyndham's novel may not have been mere fiction after all. The homicidal children of Midwich finally had their real-life equivalents. They have become known as the Black-Eyed Children. It's interesting to note that during the Second World War, Wyndham worked for the British government's Ministry of Information, MOI, whose work was focused on disseminating propaganda to try and affect the moral of the Nazis, and also on keeping from the general public certain, sensitive things that the government of the day preferred the rest of us didn't know about. Wyndham retained contacts and friendships with certain senior people from the MOI well into the 1960s. One has to wonder if any of the novel storylines in his books, including the Midwich Cuckoos, were based on secrets of a UFO-themed nature that were provided to him by those same contacts. Admittedly, such a possibility remains just a theory, but consider all of the following, and then take note of how closely the phenomenon of today's Black-Eyed Children mirrors Wyndham's sinister story of yesteryear. Don't let them in. Who, or what, the Black-Eyed Children, BEC, are, is a matter that has had the paranormal and UFO research communities occupied for several years. Before we get to the nature and potential intent of the BEC, let's first take a look at their appearance, which is, without doubt, eerie in the extreme. Typically, the BEC appear to range in age from around 10 to 14. They are, more often than not, male. They are acutely skinny and pale in the extreme. Their preferred color of clothing is black, and almost always a black hoodie that envelopes and hides most of their face. Then there is the matter of why they are named the Black-Eyed Children. Put simply, their eyes are black. And we're not just talking about portions of the eye. No. The entire eye is black. Their intent is curiously identical in practically every case on record. They try and find any way possible to enter the home or the vehicle of the person they target. Because most of the people who have encountered the BEC are terrified out of their wits by the appearances of their strange visitors, they seldom, if ever, allow them entry, which means we are pretty much at a loss to understand why it's so important for the BEC to gain access to people's property. As for the theories for what the Black-Eyed Children might be, they range from predatory vampires to energy-sucking ghosts, and from demonic beings to fairy-like changelings. Then there is the theory that they are just the latest, unearthly addition to the alien bloodline. It's important to note that, unlike some of the hybrid children that alien abductees report encountering, discussed in the previous chapter, there is simply no way that the Beck can pass among us unnoticed. The hybrid children may look somewhat strange and sickly, but they are not always overly alien-looking. The black eyes of the Beck, however, effectively ensure that no one is going to come away from an encounter with them and think sickly child. On top of that, the black-eyed children possess the disturbing ability to near hypnotize people, as they attempt to enforce their malevolent will on their unfortunate victims. With that said, let's take a look at a few standout reports. Replacing a human baby with a genetically created look-alike. The origins of the Beck. Today, there are literally dozens of cases on file concerning the black-eyed children. However, the most important one of all is, of course, the first case, or, at least, the first reported case. It comes from a man named Brian Bethel, a respected journalist, whose story first began to circulate in 1998. As fate would have it, on the night in question, Bethel, of Abilene, Texas, realized he had forgotten to pay a bill, so he got in his vehicle with the intent of depositing a check in an after-hours drop box. It was coming up to 10 p.m. when Bethel arrived at the location, which was situated at a shopping mall. As Bethel sat in his vehicle writing out the check, he was interrupted in terrifying style by a loud tapping on the driver's window. As he quickly looked up, Bethel was confronted by a pair of young boys who, at first glance, in the darkness and the shadows, appeared normal. Matters very quickly became deeply strange, however. In no time at all, Bethel developed a disturbing sense that all was not well. It was as if a malignant atmosphere had suddenly descended and blanketed his vehicle, and as if out of nowhere. Bethel was careful to only wind the window down to a small degree, and asked the boys what they wanted. They came up with a story that sounded most unlikely and left Bethel feeling very uneasy, frightened, even. They claimed to need a ride back home, so that they could get some money and then go to see a movie. Mister. Let us in. We can't get in your car until you do, you know, said one. It was at this point that Bethel finally saw the eyes of the pair. They were completely black, with no iris or pupil anywhere in sight. Bethel knew exactly what he had to do. He hit the accelerator and was gone. And so were the Beck. As Bethel looked back, they had seemingly vanished, and impossibly quickly, too. Weatherly, 2012. Black eyes at the door. Experiences like that of Brian Bethel abound. In 2011, I investigated the case of a woman named Allison who had a very similar experience in the previous year, 2010, at an Orange County, California, strip motel. It was around 11 p.m. when a loud knock at the door made Allison practically jump out of her skin as, at the time, she was laid out on the bed, engrossed in a movie. Rather weirdly, the movie was Roman Polanski's 1967 movie, Rosemary's Baby, which tells the story of a woman who gives birth to a demonic baby. Allison tentatively got up and tiptoed to the door, peering through the spy hole. She could see two young boys, both in black hoodies, stood right in front of the door. As if realizing that Allison was silently, and worriedly, watching them, one of the boys leaned into the spy hole and said, "Please let us in. We need to use the telephone." Not only did the request send shivers throughout Allison's body, but the fact that the boy deliberately kept his face pointed downward, while looming into view, and his eyes in shadow only added to the menace. Redfern, 2014. Then, something very disturbing happened. Allison felt as if an evil force was taking over her own self-will and was trying to make her open the door to her late-night callers of the sinister kind. It took a supreme effort on Allison's part not to unlock and open the door. Fortunately, she was able to fight off what became, she said, a need to let the children in. Having regained her wits and sense of self-preservation, Allison looked again through the spy hole, only to see the boy staring right at her through a pair of solid black eyes. She screamed, jumped back, and called the night manager, who was on the scene in no time at all. The Beck were nowhere in sight. Ibid. Men in Black and Vampires, the Beck Parallels. It's worth noting another UFO connection in the uncanny saga of the Black-Eyed Children. They have deep parallels to the notorious Men in Black, who have, since 1947, terrorized and intimidated into silence numerous witnesses to UFOs. Just like the Beck, the Men in Black have a propensity for knocking on doors late at night. The two mirror each other in other fashions, too. Like their child counterparts, the MIB will not enter a home until they are specifically invited to do so, shades of ancient vampire lore. Both the MIB and the Beck wear black. Both wear headgear, hoodies for the Black-Eyed Children, and 1950s era fedoras for the MIB. And there is another intriguing issue: very often the Men in Black wear thick, wrap-around, black sunglasses. One has to wonder if this is done not just to provoke a menacing atmosphere, but to mask a pair of emotion-free, solid, black eyes. In that sense, and just perhaps, the Men in Black and the Black-Eyed Children are one and the same, one in adult form and the other in child form, but both following the same secret agenda, whatever that may really be. So, where does that all leave us? Well, it admittedly leaves us with a lot of questions. But they are questions that a certain acclaimed and dedicated researcher of the Black-Eyed Children has done his very best to resolve. Undoubtedly the leading investigator in this field, and the author of the book The Black-Eyed Children, David Weatherly has collected and studied dozens of such cases, demonstrating the sheer scale of these weird and unsettling events. Weatherly's work has addressed a variety of theories for the presence of the Beck, that they might be demonic in nature, or predatory spirits, or possibly even products of the human mind, given some semblance of physical life in the real world. Notably, Weatherly has also spent much time researching the theory that the Black-Eyed Children are of nothing less than an alien bloodline. Weatherly cites the case of two women, Anne and Marcia, who have both had alien abduction experiences and who have also both encountered the Beck and, in Marcia's case, in the now typical knocking on the door and demanding to be let in situation. Of cases such as these, Weatherly says, why would an alien race want, or need, to create hybrid beings? There are a number of proposed theories to explain why such an experiment may be taking place. These theories range from a dying race that needs an injection of fresh DNA in order to survive, to time travelers attempting to correct a mistake made in their past, which is our present. Weatherly, 2012. We will leave the final words on this issue to Weatherly. They are words that fit comfortably with what we have seen so far. An even more sinister theory that has followers postulates that the Greys are actually attempting to take over our world by slowly breeding us out and phasing in beings with alien DNA. Over time the human race will fade away to be replaced by the superior DNA of the Grey aliens, adherents say. Ibid. 18. Reptiles from the stars. It was in the 1980s that a new, mysterious and, for some, downright sinister development occurred within the field of UFO research. More and more people, predominantly women, began to report alien abduction encounters of a kind very different to those involving the Greys. In these newly surfaced cases, the experiencers reported abductions at the hands and claws of what one might consider to be the closest, real-life equivalents of the scaly beast in the 1954 movie Creature from the Black Lagoon. Some called them lizard men, others referred to them as being dinosaur-like in appearance. But the one term that really struck a chord to the extent that it was soon adopted by both UFO researchers and conspiracy theorists alike was reptilians. There is a near unanimous belief that there is absolutely nothing positive, at all, about the reptilians. Alien abduction researcher John Carpenter says of this ominous breed of beast. Typically, these reptilian creatures are reported to be about 6 to 7 feet tall, upright, with lizard-like scales, greenish to brownish in color with claw-like, four-fingered webbed hands. Their faces are said to be a cross between a human and a snake, with a central ridge coming down from the top of the head to the snout. Adding to their serpent-like appearance are their eyes, which have vertical slits in their pupils and golden irises. Carpenter, 1993. Lizard men and genetics. The reptilians are shape-shifting, extraterrestrial monsters that have lived among us since time immemorial. As a result of their abilities to take on human form, they have completely infiltrated society, governments, and military and intelligence agencies. None other than the British royal family, and countless famous figures of Hollywood and the music industry are terrible reptilians masquerading as humans. They are the true, secret rulers of our world, machinating and manipulating as they coldly see fit. They are also the human-like Anunnaki, albeit in a different form, due to their ability to shape-shift, not unlike the classic werewolf of medieval lore. Or, so we are assured by some of the most extreme, conspiracy-minded. Trying to determine where the truth behind the reptilian agenda begins, and the wild and completely unsubstantiated and unsupported claims take over, is no easy task. But of one thing we can be certain, there is a huge body of data and testimony that makes it clear the reptilians have a connection to the alien abduction phenomenon of today and to the Anunnaki of the distant past, which means, despite the inflammatory nature of the reptilian controversy, we have no choice but to address it. The Anunnaki and the reptilians. Before we get to the matter of the reptilians in the modern era, and their undeniable connections to alien abductions, shape-shifting, interspecies sex, reproduction, and hybrid entities, it's important that we address something of extreme relevance and importance, the connection between the reptilians and none other than the Anunnaki, and the astounding possibility that they just might be one and the same. It's a connection that takes us back in time several thousand years and to the world of the Mesoamericans, the people of Honduras, El Salvador, Belize, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Guatemala, and a powerful and mysterious character known as Quetzalcoatl, who may well have been of Anunnaki lineage. According to predominantly Aztec legend, Quetzalcoatl was a highly advanced entity, with near magical skills and possessed of incredibly advanced sciences, who tried to bring civilization, technology, and a new world to the Mesoamericans, and who first impacted on the people of the area at some point between 100 BC and 100 AD. His name translates as feathered serpent, hence the name of a notable structure that can be found at Teotihuacan, just a short drive from Mexico City, and that was built around 100 BC, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. Admittedly, there is some degree of controversy over the precise date upon which Quetzalcoatl first surfaced, and for one specific reason, long before Quetzalcoatl was on the scene, and as far back as 900 BC, Mesoamericans were worshipping other serpentine deities, and particularly so in Tabasco, Mexico. It is this matter of a serpentine deity-like entity that has led investigators of the reptilian phenomenon to make a connection between Quetzalcoatl of times long past and the reptilians of today's UFO lore. In both written texts and ancient artwork, Quetzalcoatl is portrayed particularly so by the Aztecs as both a very human-looking entity, dark-hued and displaying a reddish beak, which is a nod in the direction of the god of wind, Ahacatl, and as a serpentine, feathered, creature that displays bright and eye-catching plumage, hence the meaning of his name. This decidedly curious state of extreme duality has prompted a theory that suggests Quetzalcoatl was a shapeshifter of the reptilian kind, one who was identical to, and directly related to, the body-morphing reptilians of today's alien abduction controversy. Aliens of the reptilian kind. The Quetzalcoatl connection continues. Whereas the legends of the Anunnaki suggest their presence on the earth dates back hundreds of thousands of years, Quetzalcoatl, as noted by the time frame in which he first surfaced in Mesoamerica, was very much an Anunnaki of the Johnny-come-lately type. Or was he? Zechariah Sitchin concluded, from studying and comparing ancient Mesoamerican texts with those of the Sumerians, that Quetzalcoatl was none other than the offspring of Enki, who was one of the original, central players in the genetic manipulation of the infant human race by the Anunnaki. That the Anunnaki reputedly had the ability to live for hundreds of thousands of years means it's not at all impossible that, as Enki's son, Quetzalcoatl, who felt that the human race should be treated fairly and not used as a slave-based society, lived throughout the entirety of incredible and turbulent times, the decision to travel to the earth and reap its gold, the creation of a new human species, the mighty flood that decimated the earth, and the return of the vast majority of the Anunnaki to their home planet of Nibiru. Researchers such as Zecharia Sitchin have suggested that the Anunnaki left the earth more than 4,000 years ago, which is long before Quetzalcoatl was on the scene in Mesoamerica. Or did the Anunnaki, or, at least, some of them, choose to stay on the earth after the decimation provoked by massive, worldwide floods and localized atomic conflict? Certainly, that is what Sitchin suggested. Some of the Anunnaki remained behind. Perhaps, even, the smaller, remaining colony provoked a radical change in their relationship to, and interaction with, the human race. It may well have been to the extent that the once all-powerful Anunnaki, perceived and worshipped for so very long as gods, took a back seat, retreated into the shadows, and adopted a far more covert and stealthy approach to future genetic alteration and upgrading of the human species. Certainly, that would accord exactly with today's world of alien abductions. Just about each and every aspect of just about each and every abduction is performed in stealthy fashion and with a desire not always successful, as we have seen, to wipe out the memories of those unfortunate souls they target. If a sizable number of Anunnaki did remain on the earth, just perhaps, one of them was Quetzalcoatl. And maybe he elected to try to help the survivors of the planetary disaster rebuild and reinvent themselves, via the introduction of new technologies and concepts specifically in Mesoamerica. He may have played some sort of role in the genetic programs, too. On this matter of genetics, Paul von Ward, the author of We've Never Been Alone, noted that the Quinault people of the Pacific Northwest believed their god, Quati, created humans from his own sweat, and that in the American West, the Salish people have a story that their creator entity, Amatkan, used his very own hair to create the first 5 women on Earth. All these methods, said von Ward, could imply a contribution of the god's DNA. And all of which brings us to von Ward's words on Quetzalcoatl. According to legend, Quetzalcoatl sprinkled his blood with the bones of earlier creatures to create humans. Von Ward, 2011. Reptilians are not a politically correct species. Without doubt, the most vocal person, when it comes to the matter of human-reptilian interaction, is Pamela Stonebrook, a jazz singer known as the Intergalactic Diva and whose music CD, Experiencer, was based on her numerous encounters with the green, scaly creatures. Stonebrook has an almost unique take on the reptilian phenomenon. Robert Sterling, of the now-defunct magazine The Excluded Middle, said, Stonebrook isn't particularly unique for having claimed to have sex with lizard aliens. What makes her story special is that she seems to have really enjoyed it. Sterling, 1999. Indeed, it was this aspect of Stonebrook's encounters of the deeply intense and personal type that provoked a wave of criticism from some of the more closed-minded, uptight, and unenlightened souls in UFO research. It was criticism that led Stonebrook, to her credit, not to slink away into the shadows, but to firmly stand up against her detractors and send out an open letter to the entire field of ufology. In part, it stated, "Reptilians are not a politically correct species in the UFO community, and to admit to having sex with one, much less enjoying it, is beyond the pale as far as the more conservative members of that community are concerned. But I know from my extensive reading and research, and from talking personally to dozens of other women, and men, that I am not unique in reporting this kind of experience. I am the first to admit that this is a vastly complex subject, a kind of hall of mirrors, where dimensional realities are constantly shifting and changing. Certainly, the reptilians use sex to control people in various ways. They have the ability to shapeshift and to control the mind of the experiencer, as well as to give tremendous pleasure through their mental powers. I have wrestled with all of these implications and the various levels of meaning and possibilities represented by my encounter experiences. I will say, however, as I have said before, that I feel a deep respect for the reptilian entity with whom I interacted, and a profound connection with this being, Ibid. Stonebrook also had something to say that might well have had a bearing on some of the legends pertaining to the Anunnaki and their downfall on planet Earth, when Nibiru made its catastrophic passing, close to the Earth. In a past life regression I did recently, I went to a very remote period in Earth's history, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years ago, and saw myself as one of a brotherhood of reptilian warriors facing a catastrophic event in which we perished together. It was possibly nuclear in nature, since I saw a red cloud and felt tremendous heat. Ibid. Master and servant. As Stonebrook noted in her open letter, she was hardly what one could term a solitary soul in the matter of the reptilians and the sexual component of alien abduction accounts. She was correct, such cases abound. Liz is a 38-year-old school teacher living in Anaheim, California. Since the age of 19, Liz has had experiences that can only be described as ranging from the fear-inducing to the mind-blowing. Like so many abductees, and whether at the hands of the Greys or the reptilians, on the no less than 17 occasions upon which Liz was taken from her home, she has only the very haziest of memories of how she was taken on board what she was absolutely sure was an alien spacecraft. Also, on every occasion, those engaged in the abduction were the Greys. It quickly became clear to Liz, however, that the Greys were little more than the equivalent of worker bees, dutifully and unquestioningly following the orders of their overlords, the reptilians. This much was obvious to Liz, whenever she found herself coming out of a state that she described as being similar to anesthesia. She would see at least two creatures like large lizards, said Liz, apparently overseeing the procedures that the Greys were performing in almost robotic, programmed fashion. Those procedures, solely of a gynecological nature, were always fear-filled, painful, distressing, and nightmare-inducing. For weeks later, Redfern, 2013. On 11 out of the 17 occasions, says Liz, she awoke, on a large table, to find herself being penetrated by a huge, male, reptilian humanoid. She is of the opinion that the creature held some form of significant sway over her mind, because she did not find the experience at all terrifying as one might expect most people to find, if pinned down and forced to have sex with something akin to a Goliath-sized, bipedal alligator. Like Pamela Stonebrook, Liz experienced powerful orgasms and thoroughly enjoyed the acts, which, in her own words, she described as being of a master and servant nature. And to the extent that, not unlike a junkie in need of the next, better fix, Liz found herself craving reptilian sex again and again. Ibid. Whereas Liz feels, today, that the gynecological procedures were specifically undertaken to secure DNA and eggs from her body, and were part of a larger, overall, important agenda focused on human-alien reproduction, she was equally certain that the reptilians had sex with her for one very simply reason, and one alone: they wanted to because they enjoy it. And one final thing, Liz's blood type is O negative. Terror in the land of enchantment. At the other end of the scale is the case of Annika, a now married woman from Taos, New Mexico, whose sexual liaisons with the reptilians were filled with stone-cold terror. Now 43, Annika had just 2 encounters of the green and scaly kind, both near the New Mexican town of Dulce, which has a long history of UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, and even claims of a vast, alien installation buried deep inside Archuleta Mesa, which dominates the Dulce landscape. In 2001, and in her late 20s and single at the time, Annika was seeing a man who lived in Dulce, approximately a 120-mile drive from Taos on US 64W. On both occasions when the abductions occurred, the time was late at night and the location was the same, while she was driving through the Carson National Forest, through which US 64W cuts a swathe. On both occasions, Annika experienced the typical alien abduction scenario that began with first seeing a strange light, hanging low in the sky. That was followed by a close-up encounter with a large, saucer-shaped object, and then a sense of feeling drugged, the car coming to a grinding halt, and her transfer to what she assumed was the interior of the same object, where she found herself tied to a cold, metallic table where she, like Liz, was subjected to a gynecological procedure that was both painful and fear-inducing. Also on both occasions, that fear was elevated to absolutely stratospheric proportions when the trio of Greys exited the room and a large 8 to 9 feet tall reptilian entered the picture. Somewhat notably, Annika says that the entity she was sure it was the same one each time was dressed in a robe that displayed multiple, small images of what she termed a snake with wings. This, recall, is a very close description of Quetzalcoatl, the winged serpent and the alleged son of Enku of the Anunnaki, and also of the emblem that Herbert Schirmer's talkative alien displayed on his uniform on a fateful, dark night in Ashland, Nebraska, in December 1967, Red Fern, interview, 2015. Each night was the same. The creature casually disrobed and walked over to the table, which was tilted to a semi-upright position, and Annika felt her legs pushed apart and her knees pushed up. The lizard-like thing penetrated Annika in violent fashion, causing nothing but pain and terror, something that continued for 7 or 8 minutes at most, after which the creature ejaculated and in seconds exited the room. Annika's next memories were of sitting in the driver's seat of her car, her clothes in disarray, and a burning sensation in her vagina. It was only when she saw a television documentary on the reptilian phenomena that Annika realized that the experience she remembered was acutely similar to numerous additional people, all across the United States. 19. Military abductions and Rh-negative blood. If a significant percentage of the world's population the Rh-negatives is not entirely human, logic dictates that it would surely be a matter of some deep concern to worldwide governments, military bodies, and intelligence agencies. Regardless of the extent, large or small, to which agencies might view the Rh-negative controversy as a valid one, at the very least we should see some degree of careful monitoring of the situation by those in positions of power and influence. And, guess what? We do. Welcome to the world of the MyLabs, a term that, in effect, means military abductions. If you thought it was the extraterrestrials abducting sizable numbers of the world's population, for possibly deeply disturbing reasons of a genetics-based nature, you would be right. There is, however, another category of abductors, those attached to a covert arm of the US military that, in essence, abducts the abductees, many of the Rh-negative bloodline, to see what can be learned from their experiences about the alien agenda. That same covert arm may also be deeply worried about the rise of the black-eyed children and the hybrids. Spying on the abductees. For decades, abductees have reported what appears to be hard evidence of clandestine surveillance by military personnel. Black and unmarked helicopters are often seen flying over the homes of abductees. Mail is intercepted, opened, and then relayed in a fashion that is clearly done for effect, for purposes of intimidation and, in a far from subtle situation, letting the abductees know they are being watched. Telephone interference, including strange noises and voices on the line, are widespread. Black cars, with tinted windows, follow people around town. That's nothing compared to being abducted, however. To be taken against one's will by emotionless, drone-like aliens is one thing, to then have the distinct misfortune of being abducted by military personnel as a result, too, is just adding to the insult. Secret military surveillance of the Rh-negatives. The world of alien abduction research is absolutely filled with such cases, to the extent that this is clearly not just the result of the claims of a few overly paranoid figures peering through the curtains and interpreting every passing vehicle as belonging to the government. Most intriguing of all, it becomes clear from a careful study of the words and recollections of the MyLab victims that their military, human abductors know a great deal about the Rh-negative phenomenon. We have already seen how, as far back as the 1950s, the CIA was recommending that African gold mines should be monitored for any evidence of UFO activity in the immediate vicinity. Someone, it would appear, knew at least something of the gold/mining/UFO links more than half a century ago, How exactly, is a matter of mystery. It may well be the case, however, this knowledge, hazy or substantial, prompted the establishment of the MyLab programs, as a means to try and further officialdom's knowledge of the Anunnaki and the Rh negatives. As will soon become clear, the suspicion that there are those in positions of power who know something of the Earth's forgotten and misinterpreted history, is most apparent by the questions that those attached to the MyLab programs ask the people they interrogate. They very often relate to matters concerning blood, genetics, DNA, and hybrid entities. It's both interesting and disturbing to note, too, that the MyLab interrogators regularly ask the abductees if they have any knowledge of long-term, possibly hostile agendas on the part of the aliens, and specifically in relation to the hybrid beings. This issue, of future events, of what we might call ET-controlled sleeper agents, and of the Rh negative link to these matters is something that cannot be ignored. It's time, now, for us to take a look at what is, beyond any shadow of doubt, evidence of widespread surveillance of the abductees. Then, we will spread our wings further, as we force open the doors behind which are hidden the US government's most highly classified secrets of the ancient past. Secret interest in the ancient past. Before we get to the specific matters of the MyLabs, and why they are undertaken, it's important to stress that there is a deep precedent to the idea of government agencies secretly monitoring matters relative to prehistory, archaeology, and religious stories, legends, and fables. My 2012 book, The Pyramids and the Pentagon, demonstrated, thanks to the provisions of the Freedom of Information Act, that since 1947, the CIA has taken a close interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1949, the CIA and the US Air Force opened files on the controversy surrounding the alleged landing spot of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat, Turkey. In the early 1960s, the CIA created a dossier on the matter of the Ark of the Covenant. The US Navy and the Army both have file collections that address the question of whether or not the pyramids of Giza, Egypt, were constructed by the use of a poorly understood form of levitation or anti-gravity. What this tells us is that someone in officialdom knows something of the connection between ancient aliens and our civilization's most enduring, biblical accounts, artifacts, and mysteries. And they have known since at least 1947. Keeping that in mind, particularly so the fact that the tale of Noah's Ark is a direct part of the story of the Anunnaki, it makes perfect sense for some clandestine agency of the government, or more likely, of the military, to turn its attentions to the matter of the Rh negatives and their ancient, controversial origins. Kidnapped and interrogated. As far as can be determined, MyLab-based activity dates back to at least 1980. One of the most significant, and graphic, cases involved a woman named Myrna Hansen, who had a notable and controversial UFO encounter late one night while driving to New Mexico, after vacationing in Oklahoma. After realizing that a substantial amount of time seemed to be missing from the journey, and having vague, UFO-related memories concerning the night's events, she underwent hypnosis to try to determine what had taken place. It transpires that she was abducted by a group of small, black-eyed aliens that took her on board a UFO, on which she was treated in a fashion very similar to that of Betty and Barney Hill back in 1961. That is to say, as the human equivalent of a lab rat. In many respects, what happened next was even weirder. Hansen's hypnotically retrieved memories revealed that, when the aliens were done with her, she was taken to some form of subterranean installation. This was no alien base, however. What it actually was something quite different. When word of Hansen's experience and recollections began to circulate among ufologists, sources at Kirtland Air Force Base, New Mexico, who were secretly following the story, instantly realized that what Hansen had described was rather incredibly a classified, off-limits bunker that was a part of the base's weapons storage area. The implication given that Hansen was not an employee of the Air Force, and as a result, did not have a security clearance to access the weapons storage area, was that elements of the military were monitoring the alien abduction, and then, when it was over, flew Hansen, in a darkened helicopter, to Kirtland, where she was subjected to a grilling by military personnel, demanding to know what occurred while she was on the UFO. Whatever the Air Force learned, it remains unknown outside of the world of the underground domain of the MyLabs. The black helicopter component. In an earlier chapter, the case of Betty Andreasson was addressed. A woman with a lifetime of anomalous, alien abduction themed incidents, she was, as will be recalled, the recipient in the 1960s of messages from extraterrestrials that spoke, rather curiously, in a form of the Gaelic language. The Gaels and the Celts, as we have seen, have an ancestral lineage that is traceable to the Basque people of France and Spain, who, in turn, are the closest living equivalents of the Cro-Magnons, who were the genetically mutated puppets of the Anunnaki. Remember, too, that Andreasson is of Finnish-English origin, and the people of Finland are known for their above-average numbers of Rh negatives, and particularly those of the type O variety. All of this makes the next revelation all the more intriguing. Betty Andreasson has not only had a lifetime of UFO encounters, she has had repeated run-ins with the notorious black helicopter phenomenon. Betty's husband, Bob, has been able to take quite literally hundreds of photos of these particular craft in the direct vicinity of the Andreasson home. The clear and repeated harassment provoked Bob to fire off a blistering letter to the army, demanding to know what the hell was going on. The response was an astounding one. The military kept things short and to the point, stating that it was difficult for them to say anything, because even the army was unable to figure out who was flying the helicopters. Go away, in other words, Fawcett and Greenwood, 1984. A doctor gets placed under surveillance. The late Dr. Carla Turner was the author of a number of books about her very own, and deeply personal, alien abduction experiences, including Into the Fringe and Taken, Inside the Alien Human Abduction Agenda. In the early to mid-1990s, respected UFO researcher and authority Greg Bishop had extensive mail correspondence with Dr. Turner on the alien abduction controversy. Of note, every single piece of correspondence between the pair arrived torn open and resealed. Someone was taking note. It's almost certainly no coincidence that Turner's husband, Casey, reported a MyLab abduction. Although the precise date and location to which he was taken remain unknown, Casey described being taken to a below-ground facility, where he witnessed several other people, like him, drugged and the subject of interrogation. He offered the opinion, "I get the feeling they want to know, maybe they're trying to find out what it is we know." Turner, 1992. An Rh-negative abductee speaks. Researcher Katharina Wilson has dug deep into the connections between alien abductees, MyLabs, and the Rh-negative phenomenon. One of her sources was a woman named Lisa, who revealed something of extraordinary value to this issue, possibly something that was of interest to those in the military monitoring the Rh-negative situation. Wilson said to Lisa, "You state in your journal that despite being raised a Christian, someone, possibly the beings themselves, have told you that you are really Jewish. I read this several times in your journal. I find this very interesting and I was wondering if you could elaborate on this. Does this occur during MyLab encounters, alien encounters, or both?" Wilson, 2008. Lisa replied, "I am a Christian and also a Jew. I feel so saddened because I sense I am hated for being both. They told me I am a hidden Jew. I didn't know what that meant until I looked it up. It means, through the blood you will be known, me and others. That is how they will hunt you down. Then, when I'm with the military MyLab experience, they call me a Jewish wench. Years ago during an encounter I was told they would try and find every last one of us through our DNA and that our blood tells so much about who we are. My blood type is B negative, and I believe the Rh negative blood is of importance no matter what part of the human race you are." Ibid. Communion attracts secret attention. Moving on, we have the very curious saga of journalist Ed Conroy. He is the author of Report on Communion, published in 1989, a study of Conroy's own personal investigation of the events detailed in Whitley Strieber's 1987 bestseller, Communion. Conroy took a welcome, unbiased, and detached approach to the subject, that is, until he found that he unwittingly became a player in the saga himself. Like Betty Andreesson and so many others, Conroy was targeted by the people behind the black helicopter conundrum. As just one example of many, Conroy said that in 1988 he noticed an uncanny apparent connection between my telephone conversations and the appearance of the helicopters. On more than one occasion when I had entered into a conversation regarding the subject of UFOs and/or the visitors, a helicopter flew into view. More amazingly, and on the topic of his report on communion, Conroy recalled, a small Bell 47 type helicopter also appeared out my window immediately after the telephone conversation with my agent, in which I accepted the terms for the contract for this book. Conroy, 1989. My Labs and Monsters. The following case is a fascinating one, as it echoes Zecharia Sitchin's thoughts on the possibility that ancient accounts of centaurs, cyclops, and minotaur may have been prompted by bizarre experiments involving the hybridization of various species. Therapist Barbara Bartholik regressed an alien abduction victim named Fred, who later had My Labs experiences and who told her of a bizarre encounter involving an unknown animal. I feel like they are doing something to me with the animal. They are doing something with my blood, my sperm, and my genes. They are injecting fluids into this animal. Then I remember seeing another type of animal running around. I can't remember what the animal looked like, but it was bizarre. Seems like the animal is part human and part animal. Lammer and Lammer, 1999. A reptilian component. We even have the controversial matter of the so-called reptilians surfacing in the My Labs mystery. My Labs expert Dr. Helmut Lammer and his wife, Marion, have closely followed this issue and have secured literally hundreds of cases of military abduction. One concerns a woman named Michelle, whose My Labs experience at the hands of what appeared to be military personnel, and who took her into a darkened room that resembled an office, involved a traumatic, fear-filled encounter with something terrifying, a reptilian. Interviewed by a Dr. Kogel, PhD, a hypnotherapist who was able to reach into Michelle's mind and extract the salient, sensational facts, Michelle described seeing in the room, a creature about 6 to 7 feet tall. His ears are large and pointed at the top. His eyes are bright yellow gold and seem to glow. He has pointy teeth and a large wrinkle on his forehead, and he has a tail, ibid. Fringe cases like this one only serve to confuse and inflame the subject of My Labs ever further. Yet, as we have seen, both the reptilians and tailed beings, including babies born with tail-like appendages, are both aspects of the overall story of the Rh negatives. They took an awful lot of blood. Then there is the 1987 experience of Brenda. A resident of Houston, Texas, she has conscious recall of encounters, in the family home, with dwarfish, gray-skinned extraterrestrials dating back to early childhood encounters that exposed her to graphic end-of-the-world style imagery. Brenda also has fragmentary memories of alien abduction events, which began in her early teens and extended until right around the time when menopause began, in the late 1990s. As for the 1987 encounter, Brenda, who is Rh negative, type O, was driving late at night to visit family in the southeast Texan city of Beaumont. She arrived fine, but not until the following morning. Her family was frantic and was all but ready to contact the police when it became clear that something deeply worrying was going on. It was only Brenda's call from a 24-hour gas station, in the early hours of the morning, that prevented the authorities from being brought in and a full-scale manhunt being initiated. When Brenda finally reached her family, it was clear she was in a state of deep distress and utter confusion. Concerned that she had been attacked, mugged, or worse, her brother wanted to bring the police in immediately. Brenda pleaded otherwise and explained what she consciously recalled. It was not much, but it revolved around being taken from her car by what seemed to be military personnel who she believed had somehow been able to prompt her into exiting the main highway from Houston to Beaumont and down a lonely stretch of heavily wooded road, where she was confronted by a black van, surrounded by a group of 4 or 5 men, all dressed in black fatigues. Brenda also recalled being taken, in what she felt was a drugged state, to a small, subsurface facility, a couple of miles away at the very most, where she was interrogated in downright hostile fashion by two elderly men whom she perceived as being doctors. They were doctors surrounded by several men in military uniforms that befitted the likes of generals. The two doctors, Brenda says, wanted to know, did I know my blood group? Well, yes I did. They took a lot of blood. Vials. They kept asking me about my blood. Did I get a lot of nosebleeds? Did I have any physical differences? I don't know what that meant. Did I feel like I was on a mission to do things for the aliens? Well, I have always thought that, and I told them. I remember the doctors looking at each other when I said that. Redfern, interview with Brenda, 2014. Brenda is sure that there was more to the encounter, and to the question and answer session, too, than she can consciously recall. She is not, however, willing to undergo hypnosis, fearful of the possibility that doing so will bring out more of the facts and plunge her into greater depths of anxiety than she found herself on that strange and traumatic night in Southeast Texas. One final thing, for reasons that she remains admittedly unsure, Brenda sensed that the underground facility was what she termed temporary. She qualified this with the following: I got the feeling this place, whatever it might have been, was abandoned for a long time. It was convenient, I guess, for them to use somewhere and not get caught. Ibid. This is a fascinating, albeit brief, revelation. It suggests that whoever is running the MyLabs program does so outside of specific government and congressional oversight. Or, it may be that private corporations are hired, covertly, to undertake the interrogations, thereby preventing any kind of paper trail from leading back to some element of the military or government that may be financing it. Using abandoned facilities, and ensuring that no same place is utilized twice when it comes to the interrogation of the Rh negatives, may explain why it has proved to be so difficult to find and track the movements of the MyLabs teams. They are constantly on the move, funded by covert and black budget-based projects, answerable to them. One of the most fascinating but also disturbing aspects of the Rh negative phenomenon is that those with this particular blood group display certain physical characteristics that, though they are certainly not unique to these particular people alone, are most certainly more prevalent than in the rest of the population. We'll start with the more down-to-earth aspects, and then work our way on up to the undeniably astonishing ones. In terms of brain power and intelligence, Rh negative individuals have been shown to have significantly greater than average IQ levels. It's not at all unlikely, in fact, it's highly likely, that this stems from their connection to the Cro-Magnons, and the fact that Cro-Magnon man had a brain approximately 10% greater in size than any other human that has ever existed, and that includes Homo sapiens. To put that into its correct and understandable context, Cro-Magnon man's brain exceeded the size of a modern-day human brain by somewhere in the region of a tennis ball, as incredible as that might sound. From the days when the earliest humans walked the earth, and including the time frame in which Cro-Magnons dominated much of Western Europe, the human brain grew progressively larger. It may surprise many to learn that this is not the case now. University of Wisconsin anthropologist John Hawkes has commented on this issue. He says of how the human brain expanded in size as the millennia passed by, that was true for 2 million of our evolution. But there has been a reversal. And it's also clear the brain has been shrinking. McAuliffe, 2011. Indeed, in the last 20,000 years or thereabout, the average human brain has shrunk in size from 1,500 cubic centimeters to 1,350 cubic centimeters. Whether or not this is an indication of the overall dumbing down of society, and humankind in general, is a matter of debate. Within the field of anthropology there is no solid consensus as to why our brains are shrinking. What we can say for sure is that even if human brain mass is on a decline, irreversibly or not, the Rh negatives, at least, appear to have retained their Cro-Magnon style brain power. Rh negatives, not fans of the sun. Then there is the matter of the Rh negatives' inability to tolerate strong sunlight and high temperatures. Specifically, Rh negatives report problems that fall under the category of what is termed photosensitivity. In simple terms, it's a condition prompted by sunlight that affects the human immune system. The results can range from the mild to the alarming: nausea, vertigo, lightheadedness, elevated heart rates, and dizziness are typical. Those affected by photosensitivity can also develop rashes, inflammation, and hives, which may be small and localized to large and widespread, and which can result in mild irritation to intense itchiness. Somewhat intriguingly, it's almost as if the immunity systems of the Rh negatives are not designed to be exposed to the power and heat of our own sun. This begs a thought-provoking question: whose sun, exactly, were they designed to operate under? That of ancient, visiting extraterrestrials, perhaps. Given what we know from the time frame of the Cro-Magnons to the present era, such a question is hardly the stretch that some might assume it to be. Negative pressure. In today's fast-paced world, one of the major contributing factors to ill health and premature death is high blood pressure. Strokes and heart attacks are often the results of this potentially deadly condition. Present figures demonstrate that approximately 7 out of 10 people who have a first heart attack have pre-existing high blood pressure. For first-time stroke victims, it's around 8 out of 10. To give an indication of the serious nature of this silent killer, which is proven to be exacerbated by a poor diet, a lack of exercise, and stress, close to 70 million Americans are affected by elevated blood pressure that requires medication to reduce it to safe levels, according to the Centers for Disease Control. Equally as serious, no less than 1 in 3 Americans have blood pressure that is higher than normal, which offers a future potential for their levels to creep steadily into the danger zone. Even more serious, millions of people live with high blood pressure unknowingly. They only become aware of it during routine checks at their doctor's office. Less than 50% of those with high blood pressure have their condition under control. And the statistics for deaths associated with, and linked to, high blood pressure are grim in the extreme. As an example, in 2009 alone, there were no less than 348,000 deaths in the United States in which high blood pressure played a role. It's one of the modern world's most lethal conditions. In terms of which races and ethnic groups are most affected by high blood pressure, the highest proportions are in African Americans, followed by Caucasians, and then by Mexican Americans. There is an exception, one might even be inclined to call it an anomaly to these statistics. You can, to be sure, see where this story is going. Rh negatives typically have blood pressure of a slightly lower normal figure than the average 120/80. Blood pressure that is too low can cause alarming conditions, such as dizziness and faintness. When the figures are somewhat, but not dangerously, lower than average, however, the risks of stroke and heart attack are significantly decreased. It is within this latter, safer domain that the majority of the Rh negatives dwell. Lower than normal body temperatures and heart rates but with no discernible adverse effects are typical, too. Bradycardia, or a slow heartbeat, one that is generally below 60 beats per minute, may be a sign of illness. On the other hand, many athletes have slow heartbeats, due to the fact that they are extremely fit. For example, at the height of his career in the 1970s, tennis legend Bjorn Borg had an average heart rate of only 35 beats a minute. In that sense, the Rh negatives are in extremely good company. The saga of the extra rib. Now let's take a look at a variety of other, physical issues that make the Rh negatives somewhat different from the rest of the human race. We'll start with the matter of something called thoracic outlet syndrome. It's a medical term that can develop when a person has an extra rib. Most of us have 12 pairs of ribs, which collectively comprise the rib cage. It may come as a surprise to learn that roughly 1 out of every 200 people are born with an extra rib, known as the cervical rib. Above the first rib and behind the collarbone is the thoracic outlet, which extends from the neck to the armpit. the subclavian artery and vein and the brachial plexus all pass through the thoracic outlet. Thoracic outlet syndrome can occur when that extra rib compresses the thoracic outlet, something that may require surgery to correct. At the very least, physiotherapy and painkillers are needed to lessen the effects of the condition. And among which group of people are more than any other born with that extra rib? The Rh negatives, that's who. In addition, there is the matter of Adam and Eve. According to the Bible, specifically Genesis 2:18-24, God created the very first woman by removing one of Adam's ribs and then fashioning it into Eve herself. This is in stark contrast to what the Bible tells us about Adam's origins, namely that he was born specifically out of the dirt of the earth. Biblical scholars note that God's actions of creating Eve from Adam's rib were prompted by his wish to have people understand that Adam and Eve, man and woman, were two parts of one whole. It's interesting to note that the ancient Hebrew word for rib was tsala. This can, however, also be translated as side, which suggests it was not just Adam's rib that was utilized in the creation of Eve, but also part of the side of his body. This would accord with Adam's words, when he said that Eve was born out of his bones and flesh. One should not interpret literally the idea that a woman can be magically created from a person's rib. Such a thing is utterly unheard of in medical science. One has to wonder, however, if this particular account is a distortion of some sort of ancient, and highly advanced, surgical procedure that involved the extraction and manipulation of human DNA to create a species that the Bible says began with Adam and Eve, but which might just as easily be interpreted as extraterrestrial manipulation of early Cro-Magnons in Europe, or Proto-Cro-Magnons in ancient Africa. Though such a scenario may outrage Christians, let's take a look at what Genesis 2:18-25 actually says. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone, I will make him a helper fit for him." Now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all livestock and to the birds of the heavens and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper fit for him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." The most significant portion of this biblical extract is the following: "So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh." Genesis 2:18-25, 2015. One could very easily and with significant justification suggest that the story of God placing Adam into a deep sleep was born out of something real, but very different, a primitive human being anesthetized before surgery, by incredibly advanced extraterrestrials. The analogy is as clear as it is obvious and logical. Whatever the truth of the matter, it's decidedly intriguing that the human rib should play a role in 1 of the most famous of all the many and varied biblical accounts on human origins, and 2, the physical makeup of so many of the Rh negatives, ibid. Then there is the issue of spinal abnormalities. About 1 in 10 of the world's population is born with an extra, 6th lumbar vertebra. What is particularly interesting, however, is that the percentage of Rh negatives with an additional vertebra is in excess of 20%. Why this should be the case is a mystery, as there are no benefits or downsides, either to having one more vertebra than normal. For the Rh negatives, it's simply how things are. It may also account for why the aliens who abducted Barney and Betty Hill spent an inordinate amount of time carefully counting Barney's vertebra. The strange tale of the tail. Noted expert on conspiracy theories Jim Marrs has observed that the tale of human origins linked to extraterrestrials gains even more strength when one considers that many Rh negative children are born with a tail. Marrs, 2013. Esther Inglis Arkell says on the matter of tail-wielding humans. Some hold with the theory that the development of an embryo shows the stages of evolution. In other words, what first develops is fish-like, and then like a small mammal, and then like a lemur or ape, and then something we would recognize as human. Very early embryos have what look like little gill slits in the beginning of their development. At about 4 weeks, embryos have a little tail. At around 6 to 12 weeks, the white blood cells dissolve the tail, and the fetus develops into an average, tail-less baby, most of the time, at least. Inglis Arkell, 2012. It is Inglis Arkell's most of the time comment we'll now focus upon. Throughout history there are accounts of babies being born with tails, usually male babies, rather than females, for reasons that remain not completely understood. In some cases, at least, the reason is a wholly down-to-earth one, such as the tail actually being the only visible presence of a parasitic, unborn twin, a tumor, cancerous or benign, or a cyst. When a true tail develops, however, it's a throwback to our very earliest ancestors and is caused by the baby's white blood cells failing to absorb, before birth, the relevant tissue of which the tail is comprised, ibid. One example of this aspect of the controversy is that of Balaji, an Indian boy born in 2001 who, at the base of his spine, had nothing less than a 10-centimeter long tail. People flocked to see Balaji when rumors quickly, and wildly, circulated that he was none other than the reincarnated Hindu monkey-faced god, Lord Hanuman. It's notable that in some cases the tails are functional, that's to say they contain fat, nerves, and muscle tissue. The result is that they can be controlled and flicked around, in a fashion not unlike that of a dog or a cat. Others hang limply and are completely useless. As for the reason why we see so little evidence of the condition today, it's very simple: we have the medical expertise to remove the tails at birth. Of relevance to this is the matter of what is called the cauda equina. It translates into English as the tail of a horse. It describes a collection of nerves that extend beyond the spinal column. As for the name, it is derived from the fact that the collection of nerve tracts at the base of the spine looks very much like the tail of a horse. Cauda equina syndrome is a serious and distressing condition that results in the nerves of the spinal cord, contained within the spinal canal, becoming compressed. This can lead to a variety of problems, including numbness, both bladder and bowel incontinence, and sciatica. Surgical decompression is generally the most profitable form of treatment and is vital in the prevention of permanent incontinence. Jim Mars notes that some babies of an Rh-negative nature are born with an extended cauda equina, in essence a tail, which must be surgically removed at birth. Mars, 2013. All of this brings us to another matter, one of highly controversial levels. There is a school of thought that believes, as a direct result of the tail controversy, that the Rh-negatives have a genetic connection and lineage to the so-called reptilians, those allegedly bipedal, lizard-like creatures, of otherworldly and menacing nature, that have become staple parts of UFO research, and conspiracy theorizing, and that may have some connection to the Anunnaki. And it's not just physical differences that the Rh-negatives display. It's one of a mind-based nature, too. The psychic side of the Rh-negatives. Regardless of what lies at the heart of the alien abduction controversy, the fact is that many abductees report that during the course of their abductions they were shown by their dwarfish, gray-skinned captors graphic imagery of the Earth of the future, a time filled with a decaying atmosphere, the collapse of the rainforests, the melting of the polar ice caps, and well, the Armageddon-like visuals continue at a horrific, traumatic pace. Of those Rh-negatives that have been polled, many have reported prophetic dreams. Others, without reporting abduction experiences, have suffered turbulent, deep sleep visions of precisely the kinds of scenarios that alien abductees describe. Other psychic phenomena are routinely and regularly reported by Rh-negatives, including matters relative to what is termed synchronicity. In essence, a synchronicity can be termed a meaningful coincidence. Imagine thinking of a friend you have not seen nor spoken to for years. Within hours they phone you. That is a synchronicity. You're looking for a rare book and can't find a copy for sale anywhere. Days later, you find a copy casually discarded on a seat on the bus you take to work each morning. That is a synchronicity, too. It's a phenomenon that suggests our minds can influence or, incredibly, even create the reality around us. For the Rh negatives, synchronicities abound. Extrasensory perception, ESP, is high on the list of the amazing abilities of the Rh negatives, too. Mind reading, telepathic communication, and psychic bonds with animals are also all near the top of the list. A fascination, and very often a not understood fascination, with astronomy, the domain of outer space, and the questions surrounding the existence of alien life occupy the minds of the Rh negatives. Perhaps most intriguing is that many Rh negatives feel that they have been pre-programmed to perform some specific task on the Earth, even though it's one they are unable to fully put their finger on and define. It's almost as if they are waiting to be switched on, at which point everything will become crystal clear. Negatives of the powerful and influential variety. Coincidence or not, Rh negative blood abounds among both the famous and the infamous. President John F. Kennedy's alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was Rh negative, as is his Russian wife, Marina. The investigation of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, more familiarly, but incorrectly, known as the Warren Commission, quotes Marina as saying, after she became pregnant, to Lee, "The doctors told me that I might lose the baby since I had Rh negative blood." Lee was very upset by this, but when he had his own blood checked, it turned out that he was also Rh negative. Only a very small percentage have Rh negative blood, and this very unusual coincidence in which both husband and wife were Rh negative pleased us very much. The investigation of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, performance of the intelligence agency's Book V Final Report, 1976. Rather amazingly, JFK himself was Rh negative, specifically AB negative. And Kennedy was far from being a solitary negative in the White House. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was O negative, as was President Richard Milhous Nixon. President Bill Clinton is AB negative, and President George Bush, Sr., is A negative. Lee Harvey Oswald, one of the world's most infamous Rh negatives. Then there is the matter of the British royal family, which has a notable connection to the history of the US presidential office. As David Icke observed, if it really is the land of the free, and if, as is claimed, anyone really can become the president, you would fairly expect that the 43 presidents from George Washington to George W. Bush would express that genetic diversity. You're having a laugh. The presidents of the United States are as much a royal dynasty as anything in Europe, from whence their bloodlines came. Dubé, 2009. And still on the issue of that royal bloodline, Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Charles, and even William and Kate, are all Rh negative. What we have here, then, is a situation where some of the most powerful, influential, and famous figures in recent history are born out of the alien bloodline. Is this a case of the Anunnaki no longer around on the scale they were hundreds of thousands of years ago, still ruling the earth, but via a form of distant proxy? That may be exactly the situation. And while we're talking about blood, 21. A bloody controversy. If there is one thing, more than any other, central to the theme of this book, it's arguably not the Cro-Magnons, the Basques, the Rh negatives, or even extraterrestrial visitors. That central, binding issue is blood. And what is particularly fascinating about human blood is that the ancients didn't just recognize the importance of it when it came to well-being and health, they also had a keen awareness that there was a direct connection between blood and the gods or the visiting aliens, depending on one's personal belief systems and ideologies. Precisely why humankind of times long gone knew that blood and the gods were inextricably linked remains tantalizingly, and frustratingly, unknown. That ancient peoples did hold deep reverence for blood, however, and almost unanimously linked it to matters godlike, otherworldly, and paranormal is not a matter of any doubt, at all. Aboriginal beliefs and blood. To demonstrate the sheer, widespread nature of how blood was revered in the distant past and in some cases, still is revered in that very same fashion, we will begin with the Aboriginal people of Australia. Their presence in Australia dates back some 70,000 years, when their descendants migrated there, from parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Within their culture, the Aborigines, or Aboriginal Australians, as they are also termed, have a god that is popularly known, when translated into English, as the serpent rainbow. Ancient, Aboriginal names for this particular god include Gailru, Numariji, and Wonungar, which are just three of many. The specific name of serpent rainbow, however, is a relatively recent one, created in the 20th century by a British anthropologist named Alfred Radcliffe Brown. Despite the popularity of the English terminology, it's completely understandable as to why the Aborigines prefer to use their tried and tested millennia-old names for this colorful entity. It helps them to continue to fly the flag of their culture. The name of this particular god is taken from its serpent-like, physical nature, coupled with its bright colors that provoke cascading, rainbow-style imagery. Interestingly, the serpent rainbow is no lowly god. It is nothing less than a creator, a bringer of life, human or otherwise. In addition, the Aborigines perceive the serpent rainbow was linked to none other than human blood. Rather notably, it's the female menstrual cycle that the serpent rainbow is so specifically connected to. In other words, it is blood and the creation of life that the Aborigines think of when it comes to the serpent rainbow, blood and the generation of life being integral parts of this story. On top of that, the serpent rainbow is credited with having brought into being a place called Arnhem Land. It's a near 40,000 square mile area, located in Australia's Northern Territory. It is an area noted for one thing above all others: it is the home of the world's oldest stone axe, which is estimated to have been crafted around 35,000 years ago. This just happens to have been right around the historic period when Cro-Magnons were coming to the fore in Europe. A blood-linked, supernatural deity, the generation of life, and matters relative to the precise same time frame in areas of the world that ultimately became France and Spain and home to the Cro-Magnons, are all key factors in the saga of the serpent rainbow of Aboriginal teachings. The Bible and blood. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, No soul of you shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger that sojourneth among you eat blood. For it is the life of all flesh, the blood of it is for the life thereof. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, Ye shall eat the blood of no manner of flesh, for the life of all flesh is the blood thereof. Whosoever eateth it shall be cut off. Leviticus 17, 2015. That is what we are told in Leviticus 17:11, 14 in the pages of the Bible. Timothy S. Morton, who penned the paper Power in the Blood, says of this extract from the world's most famous book, from this passage and those previous we can determine, blood is the life of all flesh. God has given man blood for purposes of atonement. Blood can make atonement for the soul. Blood can speak to God. Eating blood could cost an Israelite his salvation. Morton, 2015. Acts 15:20 in the King James Version of the Bible includes the following, which adds weight to God's thundering displeasure of anyone who dared dine on blood, that ye abstain from meats offered to idols, and from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication, from which if ye keep yourselves, ye shall do well. Fare ye well, Acts 15:20. On this matter, it's worth noting the story of the 7 laws of Noah. Most people, whether they are a believer, a skeptic, or an atheist, have heard of the 10 Commandments, the rules provided to Moses by God on Mt. Sinai. Significantly fewer people possess an awareness of the 7 laws of Noah, which are also referred to as the Noahide laws. In English, the regulations translate as follows. 1. Do not deny God. 2. Do not blaspheme God. 3. Do not murder. 4. Do not engage in incestuous, adulterous, or homosexual relationships. 5. Do not steal. 6. Do not eat of a live animal. 7. Establish court/legal system to ensure law obedience, the 7 Noahide laws, 2015. Number 6 is of note because God was most determined to let everyone know that his almighty wrath would fall upon anyone who dared partake of blood. Again, we see evidence of the importance of blood and its links to a world-famous deity. Not only that, it's a fact that references to blood absolutely dominate the pages of the Bible. Indeed, in the King James Bible, the word blood appears on almost 400 occasions, and most prolifically in the aforementioned Leviticus, where it surfaces on nearly 90 occasions. Just like the serpent rainbow god of Australia, so the Christian God is an entity with significant ties to the matter of blood, and he is also a deity keenly aware of the priceless nature of blood, and why it should not be used recklessly and as a form of nourishment or as a sacrificial offering. Blood beliefs and the pyramids. When most people think of pyramids, their minds are filled with imagery of the massive, mighty creations that dominate the landscape of Giza, Egypt. South America has no shortage of pyramids, however, particularly so in Peru's desert coast. Unlike the pyramids of Giza, their Peruvian counterparts are vastly and tragically underexplored, and our knowledge of the people that built these huge and impressive creations, including the Sikhin Pyramid, which has been conclusively shown via carbon dating to have been built around 1500 BC, is sorely lacking. There is something else, too. There is clear evidence that the Peruvians practiced human sacrifice at their pyramids, and definitely so at the Sikhin Pyramid, where a frieze provides eerie and unsettling imagery of just such a sacrifice taking place. The Moche people of Peru, who lived in the vicinity of what today is the town of Trujillo, regularly engaged in human sacrifice, something that culminated with high priests drinking the blood of the dead from specifically crafted goblets. The historical significance of blood. Of most significance, consider the following. At the time Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui reigned in the Andes region known as the Kingdom of Cusco, a reign that lasted from 1438 to 1471, young children were sacrificed on an annual basis, specifically during the winter solstice. It was a bloody ritual called Capacoca. Typically, the slaughtering occurred high in the mountainous areas of the region. Not only that, the Incas believed that the children whose blood was drained from their bodies and drank by the elite were returning to their original place of origin. And where might that have been? None other than the distant stars in the heavens above. As for the reason behind the sacrifices, it was a bizarre one. Pachacuti Inca believed he could harness and slow down the progress of time by slaughtering the young. Thus, we see, for the Incas, two things in particular: the importance of blood in trying to provoke a supernatural event, namely, reducing the speed at which time passes, and an acceptance that the universe around them was the original home of the sacrificed and the blood drained. On the aforementioned matter of the winter solstice, it's worth noting that Cro-Magnon man had a keen appreciation of the looming solstice and the drop in both temperature and food supplies that it offered. In his 1901 book, History and Chronology of the Myth-Making Age, J.F. Hewitt said that during the Paleolithic period, the Cro-Magnons domesticated the reindeer, which furnished them with food, clothes, and implements, and they had made the reindeer sun god the ruler of their year. The dropping of his horns in autumn told them of the approach of winter, and their regrowth in spring heralded the coming summer. The prophet god who spoke by these signs became the Celtic sun god Cernunnos, Hewitt, 1901. The list goes on. Then there are the sun dances of Native Americans, fearsome rituals in which young men have their chests pierced and are required to fast, and from whom significant amounts of blood are extracted and feasted upon. All of this to the rhythmic and near hypnotic sounds of drums, to the presence of a blazing fire, and surrounding, sacred lands. The non-fatal sacrificing and bloodletting is undertaken to ensure that those partaking in the rituals will achieve their goals, which are usually to bring good fortune, health, and prosperity on the person's family. What all of this tells us is that, regardless of the specific, geographic location under scrutiny, the ancients knew that human blood was somewhat different from, and more precious than, the body's organs, bones, muscle, and fat. Human blood was also perceived as having a connection to myriad numbers of gods spanning from the Middle East to India, and from Australia to both the United States and South America. Our distant ancestors knew something we have either lost or merely dismiss as folklore, namely, that blood and deities or infinitely technologically superior extraterrestrials were part and parcel of the very same phenomenon. That same phenomenon may have been born out of distorted tales passed down, at first, orally, and later in written form, of how the gods performed miraculous changes to Homo sapiens, to the extent that their blood became more and more unique and godlike, Rh negative, in other words, than human. Hence the outrage exhibited by the gods when their unique cocktail of refined and distilled blood was spilled recklessly and used needlessly. 22. Rh negatives and inherited memory. Is it feasible that some, or perhaps even all, Rh negatives have buried deep inside of their minds inherited memories of times and civilizations long gone, of the secret truths behind the extraterrestrial bloodline, and of who and what they really are? As we shall now see, that may very well be exactly what is going on, even if many of the Rh negatives may not be fully aware of the situation, aside, that is, from having a vague and unsettling sense of being somehow different to the rest of the human population. If such a theory has even a modicum of validity attached to it, then we should expect to see some form of manifestation of it in our world. We do. Two of the most prodigious researchers and writers on the mysteries of the distant past, extraterrestrial visitation thousands of years ago, and the overall ancient alien/astronauts scenario are Rh negative. Of course, those of a skeptical nature might be inclined to say that because a small percentage of the human race is Rh negative, then it stands to reason that a small percentage of authorities on ancient mysteries would be Rh negative, too. Such a scenario is hardly impossible, but it's worth noting that the two individuals I am referring are, arguably, the most visible and prolific writers on the enigmas surrounding human origins. What some might put down to random chance might very well be a case of ancient, ET-themed manipulation. Chariots of the negatives. There can be no doubt whatsoever that the most famous, and controversial, name within the field of ancient astronaut theorizing is that of Erich von Däniken. He just happens to be Rh negative. Swiss-born von Däniken was certainly not the first author to espouse that many of our ancient stories of gods coming down from the sky were actually distortions of alien visitations. W. Raymond Drake, Robert Charroux, and Morris Jessup wrote extensively on such matters years earlier. Von Däniken was, however, certainly the first person who elevated awareness of the subject to the general public on a massive scale. His 1968 book, Chariots of the Gods, was a gigantic bestseller across the globe, and was followed up by numerous other titles, including The Gold of the Gods, Signs of the Gods, The Return of the Gods, and Remnants of the Gods. It can accurately be said that without von Däniken's input, research into the ancient human ET issue would not be on the scale that it is today. Could it be the case that von Däniken was unknowingly encoded, and therefore destined, to bring to the world a fantastic concept suggesting we, the human race, are the product of alien intervention? As we shall soon see, there is a very good reason why that just may be so. Brad Steiger, an Rh negative. Another famous author who also falls into the Rh negative category, and who has also written prodigiously on the matter of extraterrestrial human interaction millennia ago, is Brad Steiger. Born in 1936 in Iowa, Steiger, while just a child, had a profound near-death experience that led him to gravitate toward Lutheranism, an arm of Protestant Christianity. As with Erich von Däniken's, Steiger's books have captured the minds and imaginations of millions of people worldwide. Among the many books that Steiger has written, which is in excess of 170, are more than a few that revolve around the many and varied enigmatic mysteries of the distant past. The list includes Atlantis Rising, Mysteries of Time and Space, worlds before our own, overlords of Atlantis and the Great Pyramids, and super scientists of ancient Atlantis and other unknown worlds. Again, is it merely coincidence that just like von Däniken, another Rh-negative Steiger has been instrumental in informing people on the many and varied enigmas surrounding ancient man? The story does not end there, however. When Steiger's first wife became pregnant, there was deep concern that Steiger's Rh-negative bloodline might be a matter of concern. It would have been, except for one thing, his wife turned out to be Rh-negative, too. As is his sister, and as was his mother. In fact, the majority of Steiger's family is Rh-negative. Another author and another Rh-negative. The late author Robert Anton Wilson was yet another influential figure and writer in the world of real-world enigmas who was Rh-negative. And, in 1973, Wilson had a strange experience that had a direct link to the matter of none other than ancient aliens. He said, "On July 23, 1973, I had the impression that I was being contacted by some sort of advanced intellect from the system of the double star Sirius. On July 23, ancient Egyptian priests began a series of rituals to Sirius, continuing until September 8. Since Sirius is known as the dog star, being in the constellation Canis Major, the period July 23 to September 8 became known as the dog days. On July 23, 1976, using a battery of yogic and shamanic techniques, I opened myself to another blast of cosmic wisdom and told the transmitters that I wanted something objective this time around. The next week, Time magazine published a full-page review of Robert K. G. Temple's The Sirius Mystery, which claims that contact between Earth and Sirius occurred around 4500 BC in the Near East. The July 23 festivals in Egypt were part of Temple's evidence. Robert Anton Wilson on channeling and ET contact, 2011. It's interesting to note that Wilson was someone who extensively researched, and wrote about, secret societies, influential elites, and manipulative powermongers seeking to control and decide the fate of the world and future society. As this book demonstrates, the world of the elite is hardly Rh-negative, free. But, if certain Rh-negative individuals, like Erich von Däniken, Brad Steiger, and Robert Anton Wilson, have been drawn to researching, and writing about, matters that are central to the story you are reading, how can that be the case? From where, or from whom, do they take their lead, their calling, and their inspiration? The answer takes us to a controversial realm, indeed, that of what is termed inherited memory. Psychedelics and ancient imagery. A particularly potent fungus, one that can provoke remarkable, visionary-like experiences in an individual who partakes of it, Amanita muscaria is also known as the sacred mushroom. It was back in the 1950s that one Andrija Puharic, an American of Yugoslavian extraction, delved deeply into the mind-altering abilities of this enigmatic fungus from his lab in Glen Cove, Maine. Puharic was someone who knew a great deal about how the mind could be manipulated, from 1953 to 1955, and as a captain in the U.S. Army, he was attached to the military's Army Chemical Center, Maryland. His work there spilled over into certain realms also being explored by the CIA, and ultimately became part and parcel of the work undertaken by the agency's mind control program, MKUltra. It turns out that Puharic had a fascination for the mysteries of ancient Egypt and was someone who came to believe that Amanita muscaria allowed the participant's essence, or soul, to leave their body and, quite literally, to time travel in astral form into the distant past. A theory that Puharic also addressed and that, in many ways, is even more thought-provoking, suggested that rather than allowing the experiencer to travel into the very heart of millennia long gone, Amanita muscaria actually provokes the surfacing of long-buried, encoded memories passed down from generation to generation, and possibly from time immemorial. It so transpires that both scenarios fascinated the scientific elite and bigwigs of the CIA to the extent that at some point in March 1956, an individual whose name is blacked out in the heavily redacted files that have been released via the Freedom of Information Act, was rendered into an altered state by Amantia muscaria and monitored to determine the effects on the patient. Perhaps on the guinea pig would be a far better phrase to use. It transpires that the man who was able to consciously recall the events after the effects wore off, and he duly shared them with the CIA scientists, suddenly found himself plunged into the heart of ancient Egypt, where he saw nothing less than gleaming, extraterrestrial flying saucers levitating massive stone blocks into the air, and essentially, using a form of advanced anti-gravity to construct the pyramids in such a fashion. The files reveal that the people attached to the project, which was a sub-project of the overall MKUltra umbrella, were in no less three minds as to what the experience told them. Some of the doctors and scientists believed that the man had experienced nothing but a vivid hallucination. Rather astonishingly, two of the team concluded that the man's soul had literally surfed time and stumbled on the secret of how the pyramids at Giza, Egypt, were built. Then there was the theory that what the man experienced was none other than the spontaneous surfacing of deeply buried, inherited memories from times long gone that, for the most part, remain latent and untapped, until something like Amantia muscaria opens the door, so to speak. With that said, let's now take a look at the concept of inherited memory and the way in which it might have played a role in influencing the likes of Brad Steiger, Eric von Däniken, and Robert Anton Wilson to gravitate to the very subjects that are relevant to the astounding story that this book tells. The mysteries of memories inherited. One of the most fascinating developments in this curious and not well understood phenomenon surfaced in December 2013. A research team from the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Emory University School of Medicine, Atlanta, Georgia, published startling findings that added significant weight to the inherited memory theory. Brian G. Dias and Carrie J. Ressler, who penned the team's paper on the matter, Parental Olfactory Experience Influences Behavior and Neural Structure in Subsequent Generations, revealed something extraordinary. They undertook a study that was focused on exposing a group of mice to the odor of cherry blossom and taught the mice to associate the smell with looming, imminent danger. They then took a careful and close look at what changes, if any, this was having on the sperm of the male mice. It turns out there was a very important change. The mice DNA that was responsible for causing the sensitivity to the cherry blossom to occur, increased its activity within the sperm. The next effect was on the brains of the mice, which led the team to say, the experiences of a parent, even before conceiving, markedly influence both structure and function in the nervous system of subsequent generations. Dias and Ressler, 2013. This was proven when not just the direct offspring of the mice in question, but their grandchildren, too, had all inherited this fear of cherry blossom, through the DNA of the parent mice. Dr. Dias said to the BBC, "This might be one mechanism that descendants show imprints of their ancestor. There is absolutely no doubt that what happens to the sperm and egg will affect subsequent generations." Gallagher, 2013. University College London's Professor Marcus Pembry said of the findings of the Emory University School of Medicine that the conclusions had proven to be highly relevant to phobias, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorders, and demonstrated that the conclusions offered compelling evidence that, in one form or another, memory could be passed on throughout the generations. In this case, what we have is an inherited memory of a fear of one particular thing, in this case, the smell of cherry blossom. But, there is an even more amazing aspect to this controversy, IBID. The organ donor affair. A number of people who have undergone organ transplant procedures have found themselves developing cravings for the kinds of foods that their donors were particularly fond of during the course of the donors' lives. There are more than 70 such examples on record, but, for our purposes, 2 will suffice. Ancient memories of Rh negatives. In 2009, a 24-year-old Australian man from the city of Adelaide, named David Waters, received the heart of an 18-year-old donor of New South Wales, Caden Delaney, who had been declared brain dead after a violent car accident. In the wake of the successful transplant of Delaney's heart, Waters began to develop a sudden, out-of-the-blue, craving for burger rings, which are Australia-based hamburger-flavored chips. 2 years later, in 2011, the family of Delaney contacted Waters, just to see how he was doing and to determine if their son's heart had served a good, positive purpose, despite his tragic death. Waters was doing just fine. He got to know the Delaney family, and they exchanged emails, during which it was revealed Caden Delaney had a particular taste for burger rings, eating at least one packet of them every single day, the very snack that Waters craved after his transplant. Equally amazing, but filled with tragedy, is the story of an American man, Sonny Graham. In 1995, he received the heart of a victim of suicide, Terry Cottle, who had put a bullet in his brain. In the aftermath of the surgery, Graham met with Cottle's wife, Cheryl. It wasn't long before the pair fell in love and were soon married. It was a marriage not destined to last, however. In 2007, Sonny Graham shot himself in the throat. He did not survive. What we have in the cases cited are examples of fear, food-based cravings, and suicidal tendencies being passed on from one living being to another, whether in mice or people, and whether by changes in sperm and DNA reactions, or by organ transplant. But, is it feasible that literal memories of the mind can be passed on from generation to generation? Exploring the collective unconscious. One person who was a firm believer in just such a scenario was the renowned Swiss psychotherapist and psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung. In referring to what he termed the collective unconscious, Jung said of his thesis, "In addition to our immediate consciousness, which is of a thoroughly personal nature and which we believe to be the only empirical psyche, even if we tack on the personal unconscious as an appendix, there exists a second psychic system of a collective, universal, and impersonal nature which is identical in all individuals. This collective unconscious does not develop individually but is inherited. It consists of pre-existent forms, the archetypes, which can only become conscious secondarily and which give definite form to certain psychic contents." Jung, 1981. It's important to note that there are different kinds of memories. Episodic memories can include recalling when you last washed your car or the conversation you had yesterday with a colleague at work. Procedural memory is related to the ability to perform certain acts, after we have been taught how to do them, such as driving a car. Interestingly, procedural memory can be inherited in both people and animals. The action of a dog circling the living room carpet several times before finally lying down and sleeping is a deeply buried memory of when, in times long gone, dogs lived in the wild and would flatten the grass to create a bed. So far, there is no hard proof that literal, graphic memories can be inherited, to the extent that one can experience them in either a waking state or dream state, such as, for example, one's grandfather fighting against the Japanese, in the Pacific Theater, post Pearl Harbor, during the Second World War. There is, however, a wealth of material suggesting that Carl Jung was right on target with his collective unconscious theory, namely, that we all possess certain inherited traits. With this in mind, it's not at all impossible that the Rh negatives, such as Brad Steiger, Robert Anton Wilson, and Eric von Däniken, were genetically encoded with some form of fragmentary memory that, even if it's not entirely clear or easy to pinpoint, categorize, and make sense of, let them know, or suspect, they are part of something bigger than the rest of the human race. It is, perhaps, something that sets them apart and something that drives them, even if they're not sure why, like a moth to a flame, to uncover the truths behind the key things that may have led to their very existence as Rh negatives in the first place: alien manipulation at a genetic, DNA level, and an extraterrestrial presence on Earth tens, or hundreds, of thousands of years ago. Conclusion. Having now dealt with the past and the present, there is really only one place left for us to head: the future. If, one day, confirmation is forthcoming that the Rh negatives are the product of deliberate alien intervention during the formative years of the human species, what might the response be? In all probability there wouldn't just be one, unified response, but an absolute multitude of reactions, most of them based around a collective, outright denial of the story. And there is a very good reason why millions, perhaps even billions of people would maintain, and maintain strongly, that the revelation lacked merit. Here's why. If the story of the Rh negatives does one thing more than any other, it does away with the need for a god, or multiple gods, to have played a role in the creation of the human race. Instead, the disclosure would demand that we have the existence of someone else's equivalent of NASA to thank for our very being. For entire swathes of the human population, such a suggestion would be complete anathema. No one can deny that conflicting religious beliefs and teachings have been the cause of endless bloodshed, death, and outright warfare. In 2003, U.S. Army officer Lieutenant General William Boykin openly stated that the war on terror was nothing less than a battle with Satan. Then, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld flatly refused to criticize Boykin for his choice words. Nevertheless, Boykin was wrong. The war on terror was, and still is, a conflict with people, religious extremists and maniacs who believe that they are doing the work of their own brand of deity by crashing aircraft into buildings. Also in 2003, intelligence briefings prepared for the White House by the Pentagon contained quotes on their covers that were taken from the epistles of Peter and the books of Psalms and Ephesians. One of them read, "Therefore put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand." Associated Press, 2009. Then, in 2010, it was revealed that a firm in Michigan, Trigicon, had a $650 million contract to provide rifle sights to the U.S. Marine Corps. Rather incredibly, the sights were inscribed with biblical quotes despite the fact that, by law, U.S. military law prohibits the proselytizing of any and all religions. Moving on, we have the terrible tragedy of January 7, 2015, when Islamic terrorists shot and killed no fewer than 11 people and injured the same amount when they burst into the offices of the French newspaper Charlie Hebdo. The crime of those who lost their lives was that they dared to make biting, satirical comments about the Islamic religion. So, what does all of this have to do with the Rh negatives? The answer is a lot. When the staff of a newspaper can be shot to death for daring to poke fun at Islam, and when a U.S. Army Lieutenant General can state, without criticism from his superiors, that the war on terror is a conflict against the devil himself, what we see is the sheer power that religious beliefs hold over people, whether crazed terrorists in France or a well-meaning officer in the U.S. military. And the Islamic and Christian religions are just two of hundreds that populate the planet. From the depths of the jungles of South America to the Eskimos of Canada, Alaska, and Greenland, and from the Aborigines of Australia to Native American tribes, they all share two things in common: 1, they have beliefs in one or more deities, and 2, they deeply cherish those beliefs. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There is not a single culture on the planet that lacks stories and traditions of an all-powerful, supernatural, supreme creator of godlike proportions. Can you imagine what the reaction would be if, one day, an announcement was made, let's say via a combined committee comprised of senior personnel from the world's leading governments, scientific community, and the Vatican, stating that proof was now in hand, thanks to a careful study of the Rh negative phenomenon, that we 100% owe our origins not to an all-powerful God, but to ancient astronauts that created us as nothing more than a slave race to dutifully mine gold? I strongly suspect, and suggest, that most people would not be able to imagine what the reaction in both the short term and the long term would be. Certainly, the future would be a bleak one. If newspaper employees can be slaughtered for making a joke about Islam, then a statement to the effect that all worldwide religions are based on distorted legends, myths, and folklore of advanced extraterrestrials visiting the Earth in the distant past would, most likely, provoke social disorder on a scale barely conceivable. To say that chaos would erupt among both religious extremists and the average, everyday person who holds a religious belief, is an understatement. If, in the God-fearing United States, it was revealed that the White House itself was backing the claims made concerning the Rh negatives, there would undoubtedly be demands by millions for the immediate removal of the president from the Oval Office. No doubt, Middle Eastern lunatics would, step by step, take out their unbridled fury on just about anyone and everyone who dared to endorse the disclosure. And, for billions of people for whom religion and faith are the cornerstones of their very lives, we would likely see despair, depression, and perhaps even suicidal tendencies surface on a massive scale when faced with a world without a God and without a heaven, and without just about everything else that religion offers us, including some form of never-ending life after this one. For those very reasons, even if senior personnel within government office know or, at the very least, suspect that everything said about the ET/Rh negative connection is true, it's most unlikely that we will ever receive ultimate confirmation. The ensuing psychological shock, worldwide, would likely be something from which billions of people might never recover. No government, regardless of what it knows or thinks it knows, will ever risk such a situation occurring on a planetary scale. And there is another issue in this saga of the impact that this entire controversy might have, to a worldwide degree, if, one day, it is proved that a small percentage of the human race is not entirely human after all. Will we see a backlash against the Rh negatives? Will there be witch hunts? Could vigilante-style gangs roam the streets, seeking out those not quite humans? Might there be calls to have the negatives isolated from the rest of society, as in, for the rest of their lives? Could a form of extraterrestrial racism born out of a fear that some of the negatives may be part of a sinister, alien agenda develop both wildly and widely? Will we see the construction of countless extraterrestrial Guantanamo bays? Might just about everyone who has claimed an alien abduction event in their life, whether they are Rh negative or Rh positive, be taken into custody? Such questions and the attendant scenarios they provoke might sound outlandish, but, almost certainly, they are not. We only have to take a look at the recent past to see that, if the world sees the truth, the Rh negatives will likely face futures of a very traumatic nature. When, in the early to mid-1980s, the epidemic of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome exploded, there were calls for those with full-blown AIDS and those who were HIV positive to be placed into isolation. There was talk of quarantining the infected forever. Doomsayers warned that the virus would escalate out of control, to the extent that it would spell the end of humanity. Others claimed that God was taking revenge on homosexuals because of their sins. Even the Soviet government's KGB got in on the act, spreading disinformation to try to frighten the American population. From a formerly classified U.S. Department of State document. When the AIDS disease was first recognized in the early 1980s, its origins were a mystery. A deadly new disease had suddenly appeared, with no obvious explanation of what had caused it. In such a situation, false rumors and misinformation naturally arose, and Soviet disinformation specialists exploited the situation as well as the musings of conspiracy theorists to help shape their brief but highly effective disinformation campaign on this issue, AIDS as a Biological Weapon, 2005. The Department of State added. In March 1992, then Russian intelligence chief, and later Russian Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov, admitted that the disinformation service of the Soviet KGB had concocted the false story that the AIDS virus had been created in a US military laboratory as a biological weapon. The Soviets eventually abandoned the AIDS disinformation campaign under pressure from the US government in August 1987, IBID. It's intriguing but also a matter of concern that opposing nations might well exploit the Rh negative issue, in just such a fashion, and start spreading fabricated tales to scare the populace of whichever country they are currently in conflict with. Bringing matters right up to the present day, few will forget the atmosphere of fear that gripped the American population in the latter part of 2014, when Ebola hemorrhagic fever surfaced in the United States, particularly so when people realized that, currently, there is no cure for Ebola. It all began in September 2014, when a Liberian man, Thomas Eric Duncan, who was visiting family in the Dallas, Texas, area, had the dubious honor of being the first person in the United States to show signs of what was suspected as being Ebola. On September 30th, the Centers for Disease Control confirmed what everyone was dreading: Duncan had Ebola. But not for long, he was dead by October 8th. 3 days later, one of Duncan's nurses at the Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital Dallas, at which he was treated, also fell sick with Ebola. Her name was Nina Pham. 72 hours later, another nurse, Amber Joy Vinson, was also infected. Fortunately, both recovered. A physician named Craig Spencer, who had been involved in a project to help West Africans infected with Ebola, went down with the disease in New York. He, too, recovered. The nation, however, wondered where Ebola would erupt next. The answer: it didn't erupt anywhere. That was the beginning and the end of the 2014 Ebola outbreak, 4 cases confirmed in the United States. That's not quite the end of the story, however. When the initial infection in Texas went from 1 to 2 and then to 3, there were hysterical, nationwide calls for the city of Dallas to be quarantined, to be placed in lockdown, for martial law to be imposed to prevent the number of infected from spiraling out of control and spreading the virus across the rest of the Lone Star State, and, ultimately, all across America. It was like something out of the average zombie movie. Massive, unwarranted hysteria was running wildly out of control. On Alex Jones's hugely popular website, InfoWars, Paul Joseph Watson said, merely the suspicion of a limited Ebola outbreak in the United States would give the green light for federal authorities to seize draconian powers and detain Americans not even infected with the Ebola virus. Watson, 2014. On October 7, 2014, at the IntelliHub site, Shepard Imbellas wrote an article titled "Texas, Medical Martial Law and Forceful Detention to Begin with Second Suspected Patient." Its subtitle was, "Quarantine and Detention Camps to Become a Norm in America," Imbellas, 2014. 8 days later, the Before It's News website ran an article on the Ebola outbreak in Dallas titled, "Get Ready for Public Health Emergency and Martial Law Restricting Travel. Dallas Creates Travel Disaster Declaration Over Ebola," Before It's News, 2014. As history has shown, martial law was not declared in Dallas, the city was not placed in unending lockdown mode, and no one was placed in detention camps. For a short time, however, shrill screams on the internet succeeded in whipping up a frenzy, as well as a call for draconian laws to be introduced as in, right now, before it's too late. All of this was caused by the medical plights of just 4 people, 3 of whom, it should not be forgotten, went on to make full, lasting recoveries. Imagine, then, what the situation might be if it becomes clear to the populace that about 10 to 15% of all Americans are the product of something non-human. The US population currently stands at about 322 million. 10% of that is 32 million. If just 3 people in Dallas, Texas, can wreak havoc and generate fear among the populace, and encouraged by a manipulative media, imagine the sheer chaos that could erupt should people be faced with the realization that there may well be more than 30 million Rh negatives in their midst. Undoubtedly the ensuing anarchy, hysteria, fear, and maybe even lynch mobs that might follow would dwarf anything that came out of Dallas in 2014. And that's only America. It's not at all impossible that such a situation would be mirrored just about everywhere. What does this mean for Rh negatives and positives alike? The answer is, it's all dependent on to what extent, if at all, the theory that the negatives are of an incredibly old, extraterrestrial bloodline takes hold. If it remains merely a theory, one followed by the conspiracy-minded and UFO devotees alone, it's unlikely that we will ever see the sudden surfacing of a witch hunt of the negative variety. Should, however, that situation change and change radically, we may be in for deeply dark days. They may be days the likes of which have never been seen before, human pitted against human in violent, apocalyptic, anarchic battle, and all thanks to an incredibly old, spacefaring civilization, its craving for gold, and its planet-wide reprogramming of the genetic makeup of the human race in prehistory. Bibliography. 10th planet discovered. http://science.nasa.gov/science-news/science-ed@-nasa/2005/29 July 29, 2005. Acts 15:20. http://biblehub.com/kjv/acts/15.htm 2015 Acts 15:29. http://biblehub.com/acts/15-29.htm 2014 AIDS as a biological weapon. http://updigital.usembassygovernor/st/english/text trans/2005/0114151424 Tlotnovel 8.22598E02.html #Acts3SVOSGARZ January 14, 2005. Alford, Alan. Gods of the New Millennium, Southampton, UK, Eridu Books, 1996. Allingham, William. The Fairies. www.sff.net/people/doyle-mcdonald/l_fairy.htm 2015 Ambellas, Shepherd. Texas, medical martial law and forceful detention to begin with second suspected patient. www.intellehub.com/texas-medical-martial-law-forceful-detention-second-suspected-patient. October 7, 2014. Amrita Ambrosia, the Nectar of Immortality. https://yogakinesis.wordpress.com/2013/05/14/Amrita-the-nectar-of-immortality. May 14, 2013. Ancient Atomic Knowledge. www.bibliotecapeeliads.net/ancient-atomic-war/esp_ancient_atomic_10.htm 2015 Antediluvian World, the www.earthhistory.org.uk/before-the-ca/Tackly-sm/before-the-flood 2015. Aquinas, Thomas. Basic Writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, Volume 1, Indianapolis, IND, Hackett Publishing Company Incorporated, 1997. Arnold, Thomas. The History of Rome, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Michigan Publishing, 2006. Artificial Wombs. www.mhhe.com/bioci/genbio/olc_linked content/bioethics_cases/g-bio-e-17.htm 2000. Associated Press. Pentagon ends use of Bibles in Pentagon briefings. http://nypost.com/2009/05/ends-use-of-Bibles-in-briefings. May 19, 2009. Basque. www.britannica.com/ebcheck/topic/55335/Basque. June 10, 2014. Before its news. Get ready for public health emergency and martial law restricting travel. Dallas creates travel disaster declaration over Ebola. http://before-its-news.com/alternative/2014/10g-travel-ready-for-public-health-emergency-martial-health-declaration-over-Ebola-Picture-3045744.html October 15, 2014. Beer, Doran M. The Basque Paradigm, Genetic Evidence of a Maternal Continuity in the Franco-Cantabrian Region Since Pre-Neolithic Times. www.ncbi.nlm.nih.gov/pmc/articles/pmc3309182. March 9, 2012. Bell, Art, and Whitley Strieber. The Coming Global Superstorm, New York, Pocket, 2004. Bethurum, Truman. Aboard a Flying Saucer, Los Angeles, California, Dvorzhenko, 1954. Bioethics, Human-Animal Hybrid Embryos. www.bbc.co.uk/ethics/animals/using/hybrid-embryos_1.html. 2014. Bishop, Greg. Project Beta, New York, Paraview Pocket Books, 2005. Blood test for Rh status and antibody screen. www.babycenter.com/0_blood-test-for-Rh-status-antibody-screen_1480.bc. 2015. Bloom, Ralph, and Judy Bloom. Beyond Earth, New York, Bantam Books, 1978. Brinkman, Susan. UK scientists secretly create 155 human-animal hybrids. www.womenofgrace.com/blog/?? P = 8699. July 25, 2011. British lab admits of morphing humans and animals into hybrids. http://macedoniaonline.eu/content/view/18719/56. July 26, 2011. Bronznick, Norman, with David Stern and Mark J. Mirsky, translators. The Story of Lilith, the Alphabet of Ben-Sira, question number 5, 23ab. http://jewishchristianlit.com/topics/lilyth/alphabet.html. 2015. Carpenter, John. Abduction Notes. MUFON UFO Journal, April 1993. Karras, Dr. Paul. History of the Devil and the Idea of Evil, Whitefish, Mont, Kessinger Publishing, LLC, 2004. Central Intelligence Agency. Flying Saucers over Belgian Congo Uranium Mines. August 16, 1952. Declassified under the terms of the Freedom of Information Act. Chambers, Dr. Paul. Sex and the Paranormal, London, Blandford, 1999. Changelings and Fairy Babies. https://myandandmist.wordpress.com/2012/06/24/changelings-and-fairy-babies. June 24, 2012. Charlie Hebdo. www.theguardian.com/media/Charlie-Hebdo. 2015. Choi, Charles Q. Humans did not wipe out the Neanderthals, new research suggests. www.liveScience.com/47460-Neanderthal-extinction-revealed.html. August 20, 2014. Clark, Gerald R. The Anunnaki of Nibiru, Crete eSpace Independent Publishing Platform, 2013. Cleland, Mike. I have Rh negative blood. http://hiddenexperience.blogspot.com/2012/03/I-have-Rh-negative-blood.html. March 29, 2012. Owls and the Abductee. http://hiddenexperience.blogspot.com/2013/owls-and-ufo-abductee.html. July 3, 2013. Collins, Nick. Ethical rules needed to curb Frankenstein-like experiments on animals. www.telegraph.co.uk/news/science/news/8652093/ethical-news/like-hyphen-needed-to-curb-frankenstein-like-hyphen-experiments-on-hyphen-animals.html. July 22, 2011. Complete solar system of 12 celestial bodies, the www.mesopotamiaandgods.com/the-complete-solar-system-of-1-2-celestial-bodies. 2015. Connor, Steve. The Neanderthal Murder Mystery. www.independent.co.uk/news/science/the-neanderthal-murder-mystery-8882776.html. August 8, 2008. Conroy, ed. Report on Communion, New York, Avon Books, 1989. Corso, Philip J., with William J. Burns. The Day After Roswell, New York, Simon Schuster, 1997. Creighton, Gordon. The Amazing Case of Antonio Villas-Boas. The Humanoids, edited by Charles Bowen, Chicago, Ill, Henry Regency Company, 1969. Cro-Magnon. www.britannica.com/ebcheck/topic/143532/Cro-Magnon. 2015. Cro-Magnon. www.netlibrary.net/article/Cro-Magnon. 2015. Cro-Magnon 1 http://humanor-igins.si.edu/evidence/human-fossils/fossil/Cro-Magnon-1. 2015. De Ugalde, Martin. A Short History of the Basque Country. www.buber.net/basque/history/shorthist.html. 2015. Deems, James M. The Hidden Treasure of Lascaux Cave. www.jamesmdeem.com/stories.cave3.html. 2014. Diaz, Brian G., and Carrie J. Ressler. Parental olfactory experience influences behavior and neural structure in subsequent generations. www.nature.com/neuro/journal/v17/n1/full/nn.3594. html. December 1, 2013. Diaz, Frank. The Gospel of the Toltecs, The Life and Teachings of Quetzalcoatl, Rochester, VT, Bearco, 2002. Donnelly, Ignatius. Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, Whitefish, Mont, Kessinger Publishing, LLC, 2010. Dr. Intimacy. Incubus and Succubus Sex Demons of the Night. https://dr-intimacy.wordpress.com/incubus-succubus-sex-demons-of-the-night. 2015. Dr. Lear's Bio. www.alienscalpel.com/dr-lears-bio. May 11, 2010. Dubé, Eric. The Atlantean Conspiracy, Raleigh, NC, Lulu, 2009. Eck, Jason C. Cauda Equina Syndrome. www.emedicine-health.com/cauda-syndrome/article_m.htm. 2015. Editors of Encyclopedia Britannica. Quetzalcoatl. www.britannica.com/ebcheck/topic/48716/Quetzalcoatl. August 26, 2014. Inky and Ninehersag. www.gatewaysto-babylon.com/myth/text/retelling/enkininher.htm. 2015 Epic of Gilgamesh Sumerian Flood Story 2750–2500 BCE. www.historywizz.com/primariesrces/sumerianflood.html 2015 Epic of Gilgamesh, the www.sparknotes.com/lit/gilgamesh/section9.rhtml 2015 Evans Wentz, W.Y. The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries Pompton Plains. Genetics Help Science. http://raceandhistory.com/worldhotspots/basque.htm 2009 Great Flood, the Epic of Atrahasis, the www. History of blood transfusion. www.theguardian.com/book/2008/June/10/John Wyndham. July 22, 2008. Joseph McCabe. The Basque History of the www.iloveman.com/welcome/mythology-and-folklore/manan-folklore/mac-liar 2015 Ness, R.C. The Old Hack Phenomenon as Sleep Paralysis, a Biocultural Interpretation. www.ncbi.nlm.nih.gov/pubmed/6999620. March, 1978. Nichols, Kenneth.